Chapter 1. On her way back from the coffee shop, Alcatraz stopped by the dog park. This wasn't unusual. She actually tended to park her truck a few blocks from the shop specifically so she could take this route on the way back after she finished her sugary afternoon pick-me-up. But she figured she might get some stares, considering she didn't, have a dog. You don't have to have a dog to enjoy the dog park. Although if she did have one, it might make her feel less like a weirdo. Was she a dog watcher, perhaps? A dog voyeur? Did this make her some kind of canine peeping Tom? Peeping Toms are people who watch others do naughty things. Anna's lips curled up on one side as she stacked her elbows on the upper rail of the gate and watched the two little dogs chase each other. Naughty things? Like steal cookies from cookie jars. Right. Because that's the naughtiest thing her brain could come up with. On the other side of the fence, the two pups barked and ran through a small tunnel. Anna glanced around and saw their owner, an elderly man she recognized from earlier visits, observing from a nearby bench. She nodded her greetings, and the man waved in return. At least he didn't think she was a weirdo for watching dogs play. Maybe one day soon, she'd have a pup to bring here to play. It was why Anna stopped here whenever possible, although she still felt awkward about it. How else was she supposed to figure out what kind of dog she wanted? All the smaller breeds seemed to have their benefits and disadvantages, according to her internet searches and the few conversations she'd worked up the bravery to start about them with random people. All she knew was she wanted a dog and had since she'd been a little girl. For so long, she'd been told no, she wasn't allowed. Then, once she was old enough and on her own, and knew she could have one, she'd started second-guessing herself. Sure, the cute little house she rented now on the ranch was big enough for her to have a dog, but would it be fair to the pup, with her working all the hours she was working? So for now, it was enough to just stop here at the dog park and watch the cute little ones play. She had to chuckle as a plump little pug chased a ball across the dirt. He couldn't get his mouth around the toy and kept just pushing it along with his cute little flat nose. He seemed to be having the time of his life, even though no one had thrown the ball for him. Anna scanned the fence at the edge of the park. There was no one specifically watching the pug, but that wasn't unusual. She knew, in the small town of Cauldron Valley, lots of owners might drop their dogs off and run to one of the mom-and-pop stores nearby. If they weren't gone long, no one seemed to mind much. But that wasn't going to help the pug, who'd just pushed his ball into a hole. The hole wasn't that deep, but the poor thing couldn't seem to get a good enough grip on the toy to pull it out. He scrambled helplessly at the dirt and growled in an attempt to dig the thing out. Poor baby. Anna cocked her head and watched the pug. She'd never found the breed particularly cute, but she had to admit there was something about this one's plump belly and bowed legs which called to her. He'd probably be lots of fun to cuddle up with after a long day at work. Maybe a pug would be nice. Or a dachshund, there was one playing at the opposite side of the park, or a Yorkie, or Chihuahua, or maybe a spaniel of some sort, if she was brave enough to handle a dog which wasn't quite as small as the previous ones in her list. All she knew was she wanted a small dog. It was what she could handle. At 5 foot even in her cowboy boots, Anna only had to bend a little to rest her chin on her hands, which were resting atop the wooden fence. She'd always been smaller than everyone around her, and as far as she was concerned, that wasn't a good thing. The only way she'd be able to manage a dog would be to get a tiny one. A small dog, one she could pick up and cuddle with. One she could control. Maybe I should think about getting a hamster instead. Her lips twitched upward again. A hamster? No, she'd always wanted a dog, and she'd get one. Just not a big one, because a big dog would think it could control her. Cowgirl stayed in control, as far as she was concerned, and since she was a cowgirl now herself, she must maintain control. The poor pug was still trying to get at that ball. Anna glanced around the park again, wondering if anyone else was going to help him. There were a few people already inside the fence, but they were occupied with playing with their own dogs. No one seemed to notice the pug's distress except her. Well, the pug wasn't too big, she wouldn't mind getting closer. Anna straightened and walked over to the gate located on her side of the park. It was easy enough for her to reach through, she wasn't tall enough to reach over as most people would do, unlatch it, then slip inside. She slowed to a stroll as she approached the pug a little warily, but the animal didn't seem to mind her. "Hey there, fella," she murmured. The pug turned to her, then plopped on its haunches as his gaze darted between her and the ball. Anna chuckled wryly. "You want some help?" The dog just looked at her. "Well, what did you expect? The dog to answer you with yes, please?" She crouched down, and when the pug didn't seem to object, reached her hand out slowly and cautiously for the ball. Even though the pug was small, if he decided to snap at her hand, she'd probably end up with some sort of injury. Anna snatched up the ball, and the pug just watched her. She gently rolled the toy toward the dog, and the little animal bounced to his feet. With a happy little bark, he nosed the ball again, then trotted happily after it. Sighing in satisfaction, Anna stood and brushed her palms against the thighs of her jeans. She watched the pug push the ball out of sight around the corner of one of the dog structures, and she took a few steps forward to keep an eye on it. Soon she stood in the center of the park, smiling, as she watched the little pug play. A sharp whistle behind Anna surprised her. She jerked her head around, but in the wrong direction, which was how she was lucky enough to see the beast before it attacked her. Galloping toward her, because really, the thing was the size of a pony, was a wolf. That was the only explanation. A full-grown rabid wolf had somehow gotten into the dog park and was determined to make a meal out of one of the tinier creatures running around, including her. Sucking in a gasp, Anna began to backpedal, fixated by the strands of saliva dangling from the beast's maw. As she watched, the thing opened its mouth to reveal what had to be the biggest razor-sharp fangs she could ever have imagined. Whimpering now, Anna started to turn. She was certain she'd feel the beast's front paws, did wolves have claws on their paws, shredding into her back at any moment. But her only chance at getting to safety was the fence. If she could reach that, she could climb over, but she wasn't going to reach it by running backwards. No, better to turn so she couldn't see her doom racing toward her. When she ran into a solid wall, much closer than the fence should have been, Anna let out a little whimper, which was all she was willing to concede to the overwhelming terror. Her shoulder was plastered against something hard, but before she glanced up to see what it was, her head swiveled as far as it would go, and her eyes darted to the beast chasing her down. It was close. Too close. She wasn't going to be able to outrun it. Squeezing her eyes shut, Anna prayed she'd faint before the pain of its attack became too much to bear, but just then, a pair of hands closed around her waist, and she went flying. At least, that's what it felt like. Her eyes flashed open to realize she'd been picked up by a man, the man she'd run into, actually, and he was turning, lifting her out of harm's way. Unfortunately, that only put him in harm's way. The slavering beast slammed into the man at chest height, letting out a sharp bark. And the man, who was clearly crazy, laughed. The force of the collision had him shifting his weight, but even twisted to one side, moving Anna out of the beast's path, he wasn't overbalanced. No, he just let loose a sharp bark of laughter, which sounded remarkably the same as the sound the animal had made, as a matter of fact, and placed Anna down. As soon as her feet touched the ground, she scrambled backwards, trying to put as much space between her and the danger as possible. But when she realized the animal wasn't coming after her, she stopped her frantic movements to cautiously watch. The man, still laughing, placed his hands on the dog's shoulders. "Get down, down." When the beast tried to lick his face, he laughed harder and turned his head so the dog's tongue wouldn't get up his nose. "Stop that, you rascal." "You rascal?" The man knew this wolf? Sure enough, the dog eventually dropped to all fours, and the man pushed his hat up on his forehead, then wiped at his jaw. He was grinning down at the beast. "You ready, girl?" The wolf gave another bark, its tail flopping in what Anna now realized was a happy manner. When the man pulled a tennis ball from the back pocket of his jeans, the dog barked again and jumped. "Manners, Susan," the man growled, although it was clear his sternness was faked. "Wait for it." The dog was nearly quivering with excitement, and Anna realized she was holding her breath too. "Wait for it," the man cautioned again, and when he smiled, both Anna and the beast watched his eyes. Go. When he lobbed the ball as hard as he could toward the other side of the park, the beast barked loudly and shot off after it. That's when he turned to Anna and smiled. Dios mío. The first thing she noticed was how nice his smile was. One of his cheeks had a little divot in it when he grinned like that, and his entire face seemed to crinkle into deep lines, as if he smiled often. But the second thing she noticed made her forget all about that. Because he was huge. Her eyes flicked over his chest and shoulders, and as he stepped toward her, Anna actually had to tilt her head back to keep staring at him. Part of her wanted to back up, to put the fence between her and this man, the way she'd wanted to use the fence to protect herself from his dog, but then she reminded herself cowgirls weren't supposed to be scared, and she forced herself to meet his eyes. They were a surprisingly gentle blue. "Howdy, ma'am," he said, still grinning. "Sorry about that. I hope Susan didn't scare you too much." She swallowed. "Susan?" Nodding across the park in the direction his dog had run, his grin grew. "Susan's that shaggy beast. I wanted to name her Killer, after one of the guys in my unit, but I had an ex-girlfriend named Susan." He was making small talk with her? Unable to help herself, Anna shuffled backward half a step so she wouldn't get such a crick in her neck, staring up at him. "You named her after your ex-girlfriend?" He shrugged. "I like her, the dog, better than I ever liked the girlfriend, honestly." He shook his head almost wistfully. "They have almost the same smile." Surprised, a snort of laughter escaped Anna's lips. She clamped down hard, but not before he noticed. His grin turned teasing. "I knew you had a sense of humor," he drawled. "As soon as I saw Susan lumbering toward you like that, I thought now there's a lady who'll think being run down by a dog is hilarious." Hilarious? She couldn't tell if he was joking or not, but she definitely hadn't thought it hilarious at the time. I thought she was a wolf," she admitted, for lack of something better to say. "Susan?" "Nah." His head jerked up. "Whoops, hold on." As Anna was turning to see what the threat was, the strange man stepped to one side and intercepted the dog. Before she could reach Anna, the beast planted her front paws on the man's chest, which just proved how big she was, and shoved the ball in his face. Laughing, the man pushed her down and pulled the slobbery ball from the beast's jaws. When he smiled, it was easy to forget how big he was. When he smiled, he was handsome. And though there were other women who might have considered his height and the breadth of his shoulders to be positives, Anna did not. As far as she was concerned, his size was very much a strike against him. If he wanted to hurt her, there wasn't much she could do to stop a man of his size, no matter how many self-defense classes she'd taken. Which is why she couldn't allow herself to be distracted by his nice smile. Or his gentle eyes. Or that cute little dimple in one cheek. "Now, where were we?" he asked after he threw the ball for his beast again and turned back to her. "Oh, yeah. You were just about to tell me your name." He was flirting with her? After his dog had just tried to kill her? He saved you. The thought flickered through her mind, and she found herself frowning at the memory. He had saved her, hadn't he? He was big enough he just wrapped his hands around her waist and picked her up as if she were a child. He was strong enough to lift her and take the impact from a wolf running into him, without stumbling. Another strike against him. But is it, really? His shoulders are pretty yummy. He reached up and pulled his cowboy hat from his head. Running his hand, even his hands were big, through his dark curls, he grinned at her. "You're back to looking scared again." "Did Susan?" Before he could finish his question, Anna was shaking her head. No, it wasn't the dog she was scared of. It was him. Or rather, her reaction to him. "Thank you," she blurted, for lack of anything better to say. His eyes widened, and his lips curled up on one side. "For what?" "For saving me." But she didn't say it, didn't want to acknowledge the man's strength could be used for something like that, when all she could think of was how dangerous such strength could be. So she just shook her head, then ducked her head, and mumbled, "Goodbye," as she hurried toward the gate. The entire time it took her to slip through to the other side of the fence, hunch her shoulders, jam her hands into the pockets of her jeans, and scurry down the block toward her truck, she felt his gaze on her. It made her itch, and she didn't like it. But she didn't hate it either, and that confused her. Chapter 2. Griselda seemed to recognize you when she gave you that cupcake to sample. Colton Colmenares nodded in response to the not-so-subtle question from the cowboy giving him the tour. I met her at Dawn's wedding. She makes the best darn cupcakes I've ever had, and today's sample was no exception. Seth Maestro peered at him. You didn't get a red cupcake at the wedding, did you? Startled, Colt glanced over at the man who'd be his new coworker soon. Yeah, she did give me a red one. Why? Seth chuckled and shook his head. No reason, no reason. He cleared his throat. All right, only thing left to show you is the bossman's office. Colt wondered what that was all about, but nodded as he followed the grinning man toward the rear of the stables. Seth had met him at the parking lot and told him he'd been assigned to give him a tour of the place. He was a nice guy, and had a vaguely familiar voice, though Colt couldn't place where he may have heard it, and seemed eager to show off everything Cauldron Ranch had to offer. In a subtle move, Colt patted his thigh. Susan's tail was going a mile a minute, enthralled by so many interesting new smells, but as soon as she heard and saw her signal, she bounded over to his side. Grinning, he dug his fingers into the fur on her neck, loving how free she looked, without the heavy collar and vest. For that matter, he felt the same without his. Good girl, her, he murmured under his breath, and she did that little half-bark, half-whimper thing he'd come to learn over the years meant she was agreeing with him. I know you've talked to Jim on the phone, Seth was saying, as he led them toward a small office. He's a good man. It's uncanny though, the way he can communicate with the horses. Colt shrugged. Plenty of people talk to their pets, he offered, knowing good and well Seth had just heard him speak to Susan. I talk to my horses too. Yeah, but do they talk back? Seth shot a grin over his shoulder. Because I would swear on a stack of Bibles I've seen these horses communicate with Jim, and they all seem to understand each other. It's crazy. Lifting a brow, Colt decided he'd believe it when he saw it. Taking a job at Cauldron Ranch hadn't been at the top of his list of dreams, but when he realized he needed to do something or he'd never reach his goals, it was kind of a no-brainer. The Cauldron family had lived in the area for generations, and the current owners were two sets of triplets. He vaguely remembered them from a few years above him in school, even though he'd only been in Cauldron Valley for a few years before joining the army, and those few years had pretty much revolved around nothing but playing football. I've got to get back to work. Welcome to the ranch, Seth said, after opening the office door. When Colt nodded his thanks and stepped into the office, the man sitting behind the desk rose to his feet with an easy grin. His lunch was spread before him, and there was a voice which seemed to be reading a book or something to him. Alexa, stop, the man said, as he came around the desk to shake Colt's hand. Sorry about that. I'm not much of a reader. He shrugged sheepishly. You're Colt Colmenares? Yes, sir. Glad to see you again. That's right, and you grew up here in town, didn't you? Jim squinted. I'm sorry, but I don't remember you that well. Colt shrugged. I was only here a few years and was living at Cipher Range. Then I enlisted. Nodding, Jim glanced down at Susan, who was standing alert by his side. And that's where you made yourself a new friend? A smile flitted across Colt's face. Yes, sir. Susan was my last canine partner. When I took a discharge, she refused to work with anyone else, so they sent her home with me. His fingers tightened in her fur. She's a good old girl. And you don't think she'll have any trouble working with the horses? Colt shook his head. No, sir. I've been working with her and the horses on my own ranch. I've only got the two right now, but as you know, that's why I need the work for the money to get more. And I'm happy for an extra pair of hands to help, at least until winter. I just had one of my best cowboys quit in order to write books, and not a month later, the gal who was covering his shifts told me she was pregnant and needed to cut back on writing. We hired someone to take those shifts, but we're still short-handed. So even though I know you're not here forever, I'm glad to know I've got someone who knows their way around horses. Colt grinned. Besides football, horses were about the only thing I was good at growing up. The other man nodded down toward the dog at Colt's side. And as long as your friend here can handle being around the horses, and they can handle being around her, she shouldn't be a problem. Excellent. Colt released her fur and tapped his thigh again. Susan, say hello to Mr. Weston Cauldron. The dog sat on her haunches and lifted one paw. Chuckling, Jim bent down to shake it, and she gave a friendly little whine. Very pleased to meet you, Miss Susan. Colt watched the pair carefully but couldn't see any indication Susan was talking back to Jim. So either Seth had been full of it, or Jim's ability to communicate with animals only went as far as horses. Jim straightened and jerked his chin. Come on, I'll show you whatever Seth didn't. You sure? Colt's eyes flicked to the desk. I don't want to interrupt your lunch. But the other man waved away the objection. Now that school's started and I can't eat lunch with my wife each day, I tend to drag it out over a few hours just so I can enjoy whatever book I'm listening to. I'm at a good stopping point in the story, and my other sandwich will keep. Come on. So Colt signaled to Susan and they followed Jim out the door. He showed them around the stables, keeping up a running commentary, and Colt was impressed. Though he didn't have a need for an operation this big, his eventual plan was to focus on cattle, but it was interesting to see how this ranch was run differently than Cipher Range had been, where he'd lived back in high school. If he were lucky, and smart, he'd be able to take what he learned this year at Cauldron Ranch and apply it to his own ranch next year. That was part of the reason for signing on to this outfit, after all. That, and the money. So to start with, I'm going to team you up with Alcatraz. We've got an order of ponies needing to be hauled to a nearby ranch before the end of their summer season, so there's only about another few weeks left to work with them. Jim led him out the back of the stable, toward one of the paddocks. I'll let Alcatraz tell you all about that, but I know that job will need more than a single set of hands. Maybe Susan will come in handy. Yes, sir. I think she can handle ponies well enough, Colt drawled, watching the small figure in the paddock calling out commands to a pair of ponies who were cantering in a circle, and roger that on getting details from Alcatraz. We'll be happy to help him in any way we can. Jim shot him an amused smile. Alcatraz is a she. One of my best hands, but prickly. Hope you won't mind working with a cowgirl? Surprised, Colt frowned. No, sir. As long as we both do the job in front of us, there shouldn't be a problem. There weren't an overwhelming number of women on the bases he'd been assigned to in Afghanistan, but there'd been enough for him to learn if a lady wanted to make it in a male-dominated profession, she had to be strong, capable, and definitely worthy of respect. He nodded. I look forward to meeting her. Yeah, Jim drawled, I'm looking forward to you meeting her too. Hey, Alcatraz. At his bellow, the small figure working in the paddock turned. She was tiny, Colt didn't think she would come up to his shoulder, and dressed in jeans and a t-shirt. From this distance, he couldn't see any specific details of her face, which was being shaded by a broad-brimmed cowboy hat similar to what he preferred, but he could definitely see her curves. Whoa there, cowboy. That woman is your coworker. Still, her silhouette reminded him of that lady she'd run into him, at the dog park the other day. He hadn't minded her collision or her company, but she'd seemed mighty skittish around him for some reason. When she'd blurted out, goodbye, he'd felt a pang of regret, more so when she'd hurried away. He would have liked to have gotten to know her a lot better. And discover why there'd been so much fear in her eyes. Surely she wasn't afraid of dogs. If that were the case, why in the world had she been at a dog park? He gave a mental shrug. Yeah, he'd been thinking about her more than he ought to over the last couple of days, and had even made time to take Susan back to the dog park each day, but he hadn't seen her again, and right now, he needed to put the mystery woman out of his mind and concentrate on. Colt squinted, even though the brim of his cowboy hat shaded his eyes perfectly well. The figure swaggering toward them, somehow managing to appear taller than she actually was, seemed awfully familiar. That figure looked an awful lot like the figure he'd held in his arms the other day at the dog park. Tiny, curvy, and a waist he could still feel his hands wrapped around to whisk her out of Susan's way. "Well, I'll be," he whispered. Jim shot him a glance, but by then, she was there, standing right on the other side of the fence. And looking up at Colt with something approaching horror in her expression. "Alcatraz, this is Colton Colmenares. He's going to be working at the ranch for the next few months, and I'm turning him over to you to get these ponies ready for the Calendar Ranch." Her mouth was hanging open, and he thought she was just adorable. Her black hair was pulled into a ponytail which dangled out from under her hat, and her brows were dark slashes which made her seem even more determined to accomplish whatever she chose to do. Her eyes were the same light brown with flecks of gold in them, he remembered, and they were watching him warily. As if he was about to attack her or something. He tried for a charming smile as he stuck his hand through the fence. "You can call me Colt, ma'am." Her wary expression didn't change as she hesitantly took his hand. Her shake wasn't firm at all, and she jerked her hand away from his immediately. It wasn't until her gaze darted down to the dog by his side that he wondered if he'd been right about her being afraid of him. "And you remember Susan," he offered. "She's a bomb sniffer, but I'm training her with horses now that we're retired." The small woman cleared her throat, her gaze darting back to his. "You said, I mean, at the dog park, you wanted to name her after one of the guys in your unit?" "Yes, ma'am." He nodded. "After 3 tours of duty in Afghanistan, I decided it was about time I got back home and started working on my dreams." She swallowed, turning her gaze away, and a moment later, Jim slapped Colt on his shoulder. "Thank you for your service, Colton. Now, I'm going to leave Alcatraz to fill you in on what she's working on and work out your schedule for the coming weeks. Don't forget those ponies need to be delivered in time." She was looking sick to her stomach. "See? But Jim." When her boss raised a brow at her, she frowned. "I got this," she finally said, her jaw hardening as she met Jim's eyes. "I don't need help with the ponies. Why not team him up with one of the other guys?" Jim shrugged, obviously as puzzled by the objection as Colt was. "Because I want to start him with something easy to get him used to the way we do things around here." She scoffed and folded her arms defensively. "Look at him," she said, talking about Colt as if he weren't even there. "He can't even sit on one of the ponies without smushing it." That was accurate, and Colt could tell from the way Jim glanced at him, he was second-guessing his decision as well. But there was no way Colt was going to give up the chance to work with this intriguing woman now. "That's okay," he hurried to assure them both. "I don't need to ride a pony in order to train it. I'll be ground support and, Alcatraz, you can continue what you've been doing." Jim smiled and nodded, then shot an apologetic glance to the woman on the other side of the fence. "Go easy on him, Alcatraz. You can give me your report on Friday." He saw her swallow again, then nod hesitantly, her eyes darting to Colt's and away again. She was scared of him. Not of the dog, but him. Colt wanted to frown, but he knew it wasn't going to help his cause. As Jim headed back to his lunch, Colt pushed his hat back on his head and propped his forearms on the top rail of the fence. He noticed her eyes were drawn to them, but he wasn't sure if she was admiring them or not. "Well now, Ms. Alcatraz." "It's just Alcatraz," she interrupted, shifting her weight from one booted foot to the other. "That's quite the nickname." He wanted to say something charming, something to make her relax around him, but he had to remember she was his coworker, not a woman he was trying to flirt with. "Wasn't she?" "It's my last name," she muttered. "Well then, what's your first name?" She gave a soft snort and lifted her chin. "Just call me Alcatraz, okay? Not ma'am, not honey, and not anything else you big cowboys think you need to call women. Just Alcatraz." He dipped his chin in acknowledgement, resisting the urge to drawl, "Yes, ma'am." Instead, he just said, "You got it. Want to tell me about the ponies?" It was the right thing to say apparently, because she seemed to relax a little as she pointed to the 2 she'd been working with and explained where the other half-dozen were grazing. "The ranch where we're delivering them isn't a working one." "Well, it is, I guess." The Calendar Ranch is a sort of camp, a big family runs it, and they do these camps throughout the year, mostly summertime, but there's a few weeks during the winter when they focus on winter sports. I don't have a lot to do with that, but whenever they need new animals for their programs, I'm the one who trains them. That's cool, he offered. Did you breed these ponies here? Not all of them. She seemed much more at ease talking about this and actually slouched against the fence as she spoke. Wait, maybe she was more at ease because she was looking at the ponies and not at him. The Cauldron Ranch focuses on breeding racehorses, mainly. That's what they're known for. But there are some other breeds, or even horses within those breeds, which don't always end up right for the track. A few of these were born here, others we bought specifically to train for the Calendar Ranch when they put in the order. And you've trained them? She glanced at him, and he saw the wary expression was back in her eyes. Why? Did she think he was doubting she was capable? Yeah, she offered, hesitantly. I guess, she shrugged. I know I'm tiny. I think it's easier for the ponies to accept they're going to be ridden mostly by girls if they're trained by me. Although, the ranch did recently open up their programs to boys too, which is going to be interesting next summer, I guess. Still, when I drop these pretties off, I can guarantee Mrs. Calendar they're going to be muy amiable for their campers. He liked how certain she was of her work. Smiling, Colt straightened. Well, all right then. Let's get going, you can introduce me. He heard her suck in a breath as he strolled toward the gate, Susan trotting along beside him. But it wasn't until he stepped into the paddock he realized Alcatraz was backing away, actually backing away, from him. Stopping immediately, he gave Susan the signal to still. Obediently, the big dog dropped to her belly, remembering her training. Colt studied Alcatraz, her name seemed like such a ridiculous name for a lady. Oh, she was dressed like any other cowboy, in those jeans and boots, but there was no way anyone was going to confuse her for a dude. She was all gentle curves and soft skin. And although he hadn't seen her smile yet, he knew when it did happen, it would make her light up. Nah, Alcatraz didn't fit her. What was her first name? Easy there, Colmenares. She told you to call her Alcatraz, and that's what you're going to call her. But right now, she was holding herself defensively. He'd seen it often enough, hell, he'd taught a few classes in self-defense. But it was more than just the way she held her body, it was the look in her eyes. So he held his hands up in front of him, palm out. Whoa there, he murmured, the way he might to a skittish horse. We can go slow, if you want. Her gaze dropped to the dog, who was waiting for a command to act. Was that what she was worried about? In that same soothing tone, Colt explained, Susan has been with me on my ranch since we got home. She's been working with horses almost as long as she worked with bombs. She knows how to stay out of their way and how to control them if necessary. That didn't seem to ease Alcatraz's mind. She must be worried about something else. He remembered that day at the dog park and how terrified she'd seemed when Susan wanted to play fetch. He blinked, trying to consider it from her point of view. Alcatraz was tiny. When Susan got excited, she could plant her front paws on his chest, and Colt knew he wasn't a small guy. Was that what his new coworker was worried about? That the dog might, what? Knock her down? Attack her? Colt cleared his throat. You don't have to worry about her, Alcatraz, he said soothingly. She's big, yeah, but she's not going to hurt you. It was those words which finally got through, apparently. Sucking in a breath, the woman snapped her gaze back up to him, her jaw hardening and a determined look coming into her eyes. It's not the dog I'm worried about, she muttered. But before he could ask what she meant, she jerked her head toward the ponies. Come on. I'll introduce you. Frowning, Colt followed her, wondering. If it wasn't the dog she was worried about hurting her, then what was she afraid of? Chapter 3. Anna wasn't sure how she made it through the rest of that day with Colt, so near. Every time he got within arm's reach of her, which was, let's face it, pretty often, she reacted viscerally. Part of it was fear, sure. She was used to that. She'd always reacted that way around big men. But there was something else there. Something else which made her stomach clench in a way she didn't think was fear. All she knew was he made her want to hold her breath whenever he got near, and by the end of the day, she was pretty certain she was ready to pass out. So she kept an eye on the time, and when her shift was over, she mumbled her goodbyes, made a wide berth around his dog, then hurried for her truck as fast as she could. The fact this was the second time she'd run from him didn't make her feel any better. It made her feel like a coward, and she hated that. So the next day, she decided she'd show him, and herself, how strong she really was. After all, she knew she was strong, she'd overcome plenty. Of course, she had to remind herself of this fact the next morning when she pulled into the parking lot and shuffled toward the stables and saw him. She'd been up half the night, tossing and turning, trying not to think about the way Colton Colmenares made her feel, and she knew she looked like a zombie this morning. So what gave him the right to look so bright-eyed and bushy-tailed? He was sitting cross-legged on the concrete patio in front of the stables, with Susan lying practically in his lap. He was scratching the dog's ears and talking to her. But when he looked up and saw Anna, his grin grew. And her throat tightened. Dios mío, he looked so at ease there, so happy and relaxed. So peaceful. So harmless. When he was sitting down, when he was smiling like that, it was easy to believe he was harmless. That he was a good guy, who was polite and friendly and had tried to make her laugh yesterday. And, God help her, but there'd been a few times it had been hard not to laugh. She'd had to press her lips together and remember she didn't like the man. I don't, right? No. She didn't like him. Not at all. Not a bit. Maybe a bit. Oh hell, this was going to be hard. Good morning, he called out, as he jumped to his feet. Literally jumped, as if he were excited to see her. Ready to tackle the day? You're a coffee drinker? With as much sugar and milk as possible. She glared at him over her travel cup of coffee. Why are you so cheerful this morning? Was his hair wet? He looked as if he'd been up for hours. It's Friday, and I get to spend the day doing what I love. His shrug was easy as he fell into step beside her, shortening his stride to match hers. Which was, if she allowed herself to stop and think about it, really sweet. Still, she couldn't help the way she shied away from him as they walked. You love spending the day getting sweaty and frustrated with stubborn animals? And grumpy women? Maybe he heard her unspoken words, because he shot her a quick grin. It's less frustrating if you get a good night's sleep and start the day with a 5-mile run. She groaned and rolled her eyes. Dios mío, you're one of those guys? You bet. That's how to get the blood pumping, and it's a good way to zone out and think about stuff, assuming no one's actually shooting at you. As they headed for the back corral, his dog gave a sharp bark and darted off toward a strand of overgrown bushes, likely on the hunt for something. Probably not bombs. The reminder of his past set her at ease, to her surprise. I'm sorry I didn't say it yesterday, but, you know, thanks, and all. For what you did in Afghanistan. It was easier to say when she wasn't actually looking at him. But when he didn't answer, she snuck a peek at him. He was looking at her with an expression which appeared to be shock. What? She demanded mulishly. His expression softened. I think that's the nicest thing you've ever said to me, he drawled. She snorted. That's not too high a bar. You are correct. When he grinned, she rolled her eyes. How about telling me your first name? And just like that, the hint of camaraderie they'd shared disappeared as she remembered she didn't like him. No. You can call me Alcatraz. Why? They were nearing the paddock, and her steps began to quicken. Because, she snapped over her shoulder at him, that's my name. I don't tell people my first name. But why? Is it silly or something? She could hear him hurrying after her, although with those long legs he probably wasn't out of breath. I figured, we've got to be working together, so you might as well trust me. Trust him? You want to? Hell yes, she wanted to trust him. But look where trusting a man, especially one so much bigger than her, had gotten her. Hey, Alcatraz, wait up. It wasn't until she felt his hand on her shoulder that she realized how close he'd gotten. She reacted without thinking, and a part of her which was just observing her actions was really proud of how well she remembered the self-defense training she'd taken. But the other part of her, the part where terror spiked through the roof when she felt a man touching her, whipped around, pulling his hand from her shoulder and shifting her grip. She knew she couldn't bend his wrist the way she'd learned in order to force him to his knees, not when he was so much taller. But quick as a flash, she grabbed the fleshy web between his thumb and forefinger, found the pressure point, and squeezed. She knew it had to hurt. She'd never used this technique before, but she'd tried it on herself, and it had brought tears to her eyes, it had hurt so much. But Colt just sucked in a breath and froze. In fact, they both froze, her, standing there with her coffee in one hand and the other trying her damnedest to hurt this big strong ex-soldier, and him just letting her. There'd been a moment there, right after she grabbed him, when she'd seen the flare of anger in his eyes. He'd wanted to defend himself, to pull away. But he hadn't, because she'd also seen, in that moment, the way he forced that anger down, the way he'd gotten control of himself. The way he made the decision to just keep letting her hurt him. It was crazy. It was sweet. It was like he understood why she was doing it and didn't want to take that control away from her. But from the way his nostrils flared, and were still flaring, he was still in a lot of pain. "Sorry," he croaked, breaking the spell. As if his words burned her, she dropped his hand, taking 2 big steps back. He was breathing heavily, and so was she, and when he lifted his hand to rub at the pressure point where she'd hurt him, she had to look away, guilt gnawing at her insides. "I just don't like to be touched," she mumbled. "Got it. No touching." He was still rubbing his hand. "I'm sorry if I scared you." Remembering what she'd inadvertently let slip yesterday, Anna glanced warily at him. He was staring back, just as concerned. Was he worried about her? "I'm fine." She lifted her chin, and when Susan gave a bark somewhere off in the distance, Anna was proud of the fact she didn't even flinch. "And you didn't scare me, you just startled me." Something shifted in his blue eyes. It wasn't pity, but maybe sadness? "Sorry," he repeated. She wasn't sure what alerted him, but he suddenly flexed his knees and spun around, as if he were about to drop into a crouch. Instead, he lifted both hands, palm out. In this position, she could see over his head, and watched Susan come to a dust-raising, skidding halt. The dog had obviously been bounding happily to her master, but when Colt gave the order, she froze. The animal really was well trained. Exhaling, Colt slowly stood, lowering his hands, palm down. "Easy. Come," he said softly. Susan cocked her head to the side, let out a little whine, then began to cautiously pick her way across the dusty yard toward them. "Our new friend doesn't like to be touched," Colt murmured to the dog, as she reached his side. He patted Susan's head. "And doesn't like to be startled by big slobbery dogs either." He was trying to be light-hearted, she could tell. But there was something in his tone, something which made her bristle. He was apologizing for her. To a dog. Well, to hell with that. She wasn't scared of Susan, not really. Just cautious. So she took a deep breath, lifted her chin, gritted her teeth, and held out a hand. "I guess, if we're going to be working together, I should be okay with her, huh?" Surprise flashed across Colt's handsome face, but he hid it by glancing down at his dog. "Are you sure?" Before she had a chance to change her mind, he said, "Susan, say hello to Alcatraz." On command, the dog gave a sharp, almost friendly bark, and trotted toward her. Anna steeled herself, refusing to back away. But Susan stopped just out of reach and sat on her haunches. Cautiously, Anna reached out and patted her nose, grateful the beast was staying absolutely still. But then Susan woofed and shifted her weight, then lifted up one paw, just like dogs did in movies. Anna had never actually seen one do it in real life, which is why she smiled. "Hello there," she murmured, not having to bend far at all, to reach down and shake Susan's paw. "You're a good girl, aren't you?" She hadn't been expecting an answer, but the dog yipped happily. When she dropped her paw, Susan bounded to her feet again, fast enough to startle Anna. But she didn't back away. It was as if she weren't as nervous around the huge beast anymore. As Susan trotted happily toward the corral, Anna met Colt's eyes. He looked shocked, almost, and his gaze was on her lips. That's when she realized she was still smiling and quickly dropped back to her habitual wariness. She cleared her throat. I guess she's not so, startling after all. Yeah. He shook his head, then pushed his hat back far enough to scratch his head. You know, just because she's big and kinda scary looking at first, doesn't mean she's not a sweetheart underneath. You just gotta get to know her. From the way he was watching her, she wondered if he was really talking about the dog, or himself. Big and scary looking, she repeated wryly. Maybe it was her tone. Maybe Colt took that as a chance to tease her or something, because his lips tugged up on one side. Yeah, he drawled. Really hairy. Lots of drool. He reached up and shoved his index fingers in between his incisors and his upper lip. Big fangs. He looked so ridiculous, and his words had come out sounding so funny, that Anna felt herself smiling again. Drool? Fangs? He dropped his fingers to his jeans and wiped them off. Yeah. I've been known to drool when I sleep too. And your fangs? It felt strange to be teasing a man like this, but Colt seemed to encourage it. Oh, my fangs. Yeah, sure. Vicious. He grinned hugely, and she realized his teeth weren't quite straight. Not really crooked, or anything, but one top tooth was slightly in front of the other, and there was a little gap. How had she not noticed that before, what with all the smiling he did? It made him look more approachable. Gentler, somehow. That, and the dimple. Oh yeah, the dimple helped. Fighting her smile again, she shook her head. Vicious. Definitely. His expression suddenly turned serious. Like I said yesterday, Alcatraz, Susan isn't a threat. She'd never hurt you. He dropped his chin and held her gaze. And neither will I. He seemed to be waiting for a response, so Anna shrugged. How to explain it? And how to explain and get it over with before her coffee got too cold? I don't know you, Colton, she finally said. I mean, I just met you. You don't trust me yet. He nodded as if it was a foregone conclusion. But she shook her head. She'd worked with the men on this ranch for years, and though she trusted them, she still didn't let them touch her. You're a lot bigger than me, she tried to explain. Everyone is a lot bigger than me. You might, Susan might just think she was playing or something, having fun, you know? The way she does with you. But, she lifted her coffee to her lips, just to have something to focus on. But if she did that with me, she could seriously hurt me. I've learned to be cautious. He was watching her, and she peeked at him from under her lashes, pretending to be fascinated by the lid of her coffee cup. Finally, he asked hesitantly, and, you've learned that lesson from experience? I mean, that you have to be cautious, because big dogs might hurt you? She heard the hesitation before the word dogs and knew he'd meant men. Knew what he was asking. So she took a deep breath, met his eyes, and told him the truth, hoping he'd understand. Yes. Slowly, he nodded, his wide lips pulled downward in an expression she was already recognizing as appearing wrong and out of place on his face. But it was the understanding in his blue eyes which made her wince. He'd understood what she'd meant and hadn't liked it. Well, join the team, mister. I don't like it either. I'm sorry, he began. But she was irritated with herself for revealing so much, so she brushed off whatever he'd been about to say. I just wanted to explain why Susan made me nervous. Susan, and Susan's owner. Don't do anything to apologize for, and we'll get along fine. Well then, again, I'm sorry for touching you without your permission. Sheepishly, he rubbed at his hand. I can personally attest that you might be short, Alcatraz, but you're not defenseless. That was a wicked grip you had on me. See, even though you could have broken my hold any time you wanted to. But he hadn't. He'd let her keep control. So she just snorted and finally, took a sip of her coffee. "Come on," she said, jerking her head toward the corral, "let's get to work." And somehow, today was easier. Maybe it was because of their conversation, maybe it was the way she kept catching Colt looking at her, with respect in his eyes. Or maybe it was just because it was a gorgeous day and she got to spend it working with horses and a beautiful man. Whatever it was a pretty good Friday, all around. Chapter 4. Colton made sure to arrive at Cauldron Ranch early Monday morning, 2 coffees in hand from his favorite place in town. Honestly, it wasn't that much of a hardship to get up a little earlier and swing by the coffee shop. He'd always been an early riser, and that had been helpful when he'd lived on Cipher Range. There'd been some guys there who had been typical teens, as in they'd slept late whenever possible. But Colt had gotten a reputation as the one who had always been awake and finished with his chores before Mrs. Cipher was even ready to cook breakfast. Joining the army hadn't helped. Now, Colt figured he was incapable of sleeping past 6, even on weekends. Of course, if he had his way and was able to build his ranch into a success, he wouldn't be able to take weekends. Every day would be full of hard work, dirt, and exhaustion. He couldn't wait. But for now, he had to build up more of a nest egg, so he was content to get up even earlier to go on his run, finish his chores, work with his own horses, and then head into Cauldron Valley for coffee. And he was still ready and waiting at the stables of Cauldron Ranch before Alcatraz showed up, but when she did, she stopped short as Susan came bounding up to her. He saw the way she froze, obviously scared, no matter what she'd claimed on Friday. But then, just as quickly, she relaxed, her shoulders slumping as she reached out to scratch under the dog's chin. Susan woofed happily, her tail thumping, as Alcatraz switched her scratches to behind the dog's ear. She wasn't afraid anymore. Colt smiled, pleased he'd been able to help her get to know one big dog at least, but the reminder of what she'd told him on Friday, how she'd learned to be cautious around big men, had his smile fading once more. Who had taught her that terrible lesson? And could Colt break his nose? The thought of some big man, someone so much bigger than her, hurting Alcatraz, well, the thought made his stomach clench. Imagine a man using his strength to hurt instead of to protect. It was ludicrous. It was immoral. Susan followed Alcatraz as she stepped toward the porch, and when the dog realized she wasn't getting any more scratches, crossed to lay beside Colt's feet. When he looked up, Alcatraz was staring at him, but then her light eyes dropped to the 2 cups in his hand. Slowly, one brow raised. From her, that was as good as a burst of laughter, and Colt grinned again. "I picked you up some coffee. Hope you don't mind? It's full of sugar and milk." "You remembered," she murmured, stepping forward to take it from him. When she did, her fingers brushed against his, and the jolt of warmth shot up his arm. He'd been expecting it, thanks to the experience of lifting her at the dog park a week ago, but it still made him flush, that, and the surprise in her voice. "Of course," he managed to say, then cleared his throat. "I remember everything about you." But he slammed his teeth shut and didn't let that last part escape. She didn't seem to notice, instead taking a sip of the hot brew. She hummed, closing her eyes in obvious enjoyment, and he eagerly drank in her pleasure. "She's really something, isn't she?" Part of him wanted to scoff and remind himself she was just a coworker. A mysterious one, okay, and one he wanted to know more about. But the other part of him pointed out, hello? Beautiful, mysterious coworkers were the best kind. He wanted to know everything about her, what made her so prickly, why she worked here on the ranch if big dogs scared her, what she loved besides sugary coffee. When she lowered the cup, one side of her lips tugged upward. It wasn't as big a smile as he'd seen on Friday when she'd petted Susan. That had really been something. He'd been right too, her whole demeanor did change when she smiled. But this smile, it was nice. Well worth the extra effort of getting her coffee. He vowed to do so more often if it made her this happy. Instead of immediately heading for the corral as they'd done last week, she propped her hip against one of the columns holding up the porch and sipped at her coffee again. "This is really good." She eyed the logo on the cup. "And it's from my favorite place too." Colt's grin flashed. Mine too. So that was something else he learned about her, good. I usually make my coffee at home, but I figured, today, I needed a little treat. He waggled his cup, which he hadn't really touched, since he'd made himself a pot of coffee when he'd woken up 3 hours ago. His cup now was really just for show. Me too. She did that one-sided lip tug thing, which he was beginning to realize was her version of a smile. Where's home for you? She was interested? He'd be happy to share more about himself. So Colt lowered himself to the edge of the porch, stretched his booted feet out in front of him, and watched a distant figure working with a large horse out front. I've got a spread on the other side of town. It's small, but I bought it outright when I left the army. Now I've just gotta earn enough money to start the herd I want. You're a rancher? She asked with surprise. When he glanced at her, she was staring at him with raised brows. He shrugged self-consciously. Why not? It was the one job I tried before the army that I actually liked. I'm good with horses. Yeah, you are, she admitted in a quiet voice, and the praise made him swell. How about you? He asked. Where do you live? He knew it had to be nearby. She took another long sip of coffee, and Colt wondered if she were trying to decide what to tell him. Finally, she jerked her head toward the dirt road which led in the opposite direction of the main road. There's a little neighborhood on the backside of the ranch. The Cauldrons started building houses a few generations ago, and they add a few more every once in a while. It's all ranch hands, mostly married or families, because the single cowboys live in the bunkhouse. But you'd rather have a house? She shrugged. There's benefits. How was your weekend? The change in topic was abrupt, and he took a moment to wonder about it. Did she not want to talk about her house, or was she just awkward when it came to making conversation? Also, why hadn't they started work for the day? Not that he was complaining, sitting here with her and sipping coffee while Susan rested in the shade was a perfectly nice start to a workday. I caught up on a lot of repairs on the barn at my place. All by yourself? She sounded impressed. Sure. Shrugging, he explained, I told you, it's a small spread, and it's been neglected for a decade or so. I'm determined to get it back in order without having to pay too much more. She was half done with her coffee already. That's impressive. Good for you. Another compliment? She was going to give him a swollen head. How about you? How was your weekend? It seemed so natural to sit and chat about their personal lives, as if they were friends, or getting there. She hummed. It was nice. Just some stuff around the house, cleaning mostly. When she peeked at him over her cup, she seemed almost shy. And I went to a dog adoption fair at the shelter. It was the hesitant way she confessed it, as if she were trying to share a part of her life with him, which made him perk up. Really? Did you pick out a dog to adopt? Did you bring it? He looked around, although he was fairly certain if she had brought a new dog along, Susan wouldn't be settled so nicely. Alcatraz flushed, which made her look adorably approachable. No, I'm not quite ready yet. I just went to look. I'm not sure what kind of dog I want. Shrugging, he dropped his weight to one palm. You've got a house of your own, so you could get any kind. What are you thinking? I only rent the house, and it's small. Still, pets are allowed. She glanced down at her almost empty cup. I'm thinking something small. I could handle a tiny dog. Ah. That statement was more telling than she might have realized. Slowly, Colt pushed himself forward, resting his elbows on his knees where he was cradling his barely touched coffee cup between them. You know, there's nothing inherently wrong with big dogs. Some might be dangerous, but it all has to do with how they're raised and what kind of personality they have. They can be just as fun, affectionate, and gentle as small dogs. She was eyeing him suspiciously. You're not really talking about big dogs, are you? He hadn't been, no. Hey, if the metaphor fits. One side of her lips tugged upward again. I've just never been comfortable around big dogs, okay? Maybe you need a hamster. That surprised a snort out of her, and he wondered if it was her version of a laugh. Sure enough, she smiled, a real smile, the sort she'd shown last Friday when she'd shaken Susan's hand. It was over and gone before he could react, but he vowed to cherish the memory. I've considered that, yeah. Tipping her cup up, she finished the rest of her coffee. Now, drink up and let's go. When she nodded to his cup, he realized she'd been paying attention to how much he had, or rather, hadn't, been drinking. Time for work? She shook her head. We're heading to the Calendar Ranch this morning. I've got to meet with Val Calendar about taking the delivery of the ponies and check out the accommodations, that sort of thing. He quirked a brow. You don't mind me riding along? That depends. Are you going to bring Susan? His gaze dropped to the dog. They were back to this? She goes where I go, he offered stiffly. Okay then, I guess I have to bring you if I want to bring her. Colt's eyes snapped back to hers. Was she serious? Or was that a joke? One side of her lips twitched as she crumbled the empty coffee cup in her fist. We'll leave as soon as I get back. Still surprised, Colt shook his head as if to clear it. Where are you going? To the little cowgirl's room, nosy. That coffee goes right through me. His eyes widened, but she was already turning toward the stables. Why, Ms. Alcatraz, he drawled, did you just make a joke? Without looking at him, she brushed some imaginary lint from her shoulder, and he burst into laughter. Her sense of humor was clearly as dry as an arroyo in summer, but it was there. And he liked it. He liked that he'd gotten to see it. He liked her. Later, in the truck on the way to the Calendar Ranch, Colt decided to see if he could tease out some of that humor some more. You know, with you being so tiny, it seems weird for you to drive such a big truck. He pushed his feet out as far as they'd go. There's plenty of space in here for me. Yeah, but not you and your dog. Her lips twitched against as she glanced in her rearview mirror, where Susan was sitting in the bed of the truck, tongue lolling with glee. That's her favorite place, Colt replied, turning to look over his shoulder. She just looks so darn happy, you know? See? The wind in her hair, her drool flying behind her, what's not to be happy about? He grinned. There was that dry wit. So, I'm assuming you got a big truck, because of your work on the ranch? It must not be easy, she'd basically needed a step stool to climb in. Nope. Her expression was blank as she turned onto the main road. I got a big truck, because I'm overcompensating. He managed to smother his laughter in time. Surely she wasn't referring to the joke about men who drove big trucks. What do you mean? She shrugged, still not looking at him. Well, this might be a surprise, but my penis is very, very small. That did it, he burst into chuckles, but he watched her and liked the way she flashed her quick smile, which was there and gone before he could enjoy it. Well, if you've got a tiny penis, he finally managed to say, I can see why you had to get such a big truck. We can't all be as blessed as I am. He ended with a sigh. She cut her eyes his way. It's probably not appropriate to tell your coworker the size of your penis, she said, her tone almost wary again. So he shrugged, not pointing out she'd started it. We're just two friends joking around, Alcatraz, nothing to be freaked about. After a while, she hummed thoughtfully, and he knew that was as much as he was going to get out of her. So he checked on Susan, then tried another conversational gambit. You know, if we're friendly enough to joke about our penis sizes, don't you think I should know your first name? You know all of my names. I don't know your middle name. It's Melvin. She turned to him so quickly, the steering wheel actually jerked under her hands, and she had to compensate, getting them back into the lane. After a moment, she shot a more subtle incredulous look his way. Melvin, she repeated, Colton Melvin Colmenares. She paused, then shook her head. I don't believe you. Good, because it's Andrew. I think it was my grandfather's name. You think? He wasn't going to lay all his secrets out in front of her if she wasn't going to reciprocate, so he changed the subject. Now that you know my middle name, can I know your first? She was silent for a long moment, her lips tugging down in a thoughtful frown. Finally, she began slowly, everyone on the ranch knows me as Alcatraz. That's my last name and I'm fine with people calling me that, but it doesn't really fit you. Light brown eyes darted his way for just a moment. Why not? Because it's so, he blew out a breath. Look, I know it's your last name, but it's a hard name. It's so, I dunno, rough. Tough. She shrugged. I'm a cowgirl. Colt blinked at her. I'm a cowgirl. She'd said it so simply, like that explained everything. She was a cowgirl, and she needed to have a rough and tough name? But she wasn't rough and tough. She was tiny and pretty and someone who deserved to be protected. Warily, he studied her profile as she turned through the front gates of a property with a fancy archway which declared this the Calendar Ranch. He knew he couldn't tell her she was pretty and delicate, that wouldn't go over well. Besides, she wasn't delicate, she was just. He sighed quietly, not certain he knew what he was talking about. All he knew was, the name Alcatraz didn't exactly fit this mysterious little cowgirl sitting next to him. But before he could figure out how to put that thought into words, she slid the truck into park in front of a big building. Okay, we're here. Val should be waiting for us around back. I've just gotta climb my way out of this big-ass truck, and we can go meet her. He paused, hand on the door handle. You want me to get you a ladder? Nah, I keep my rappelling equipment in the cab. He chuckled, glad she was back to joking with him. You know what, Alcatraz? Your penis might be tiny. One might say minuscule. Non-existent, even, she interrupted. But you've got a pretty big set of cojones. She didn't laugh, but she did snort, and that was good enough for him. Chapter 5. A big set of cojones? Huh. Anna knew it was inappropriate to joke about things like that, but she couldn't help the little spring in her step as they headed for the stables behind the Calendar Ranch house. She'd been a cowgirl her entire adult life and had worked at the Cauldron Ranch for most of that time. She knew how men thought and knew that complimenting the size of one another's balls was normal. As weird as it was. So yeah, she was used to jokes like that and throwing taunts back and forth, that sort of thing, and she knew it was a compliment. But somehow, when Colt said stuff like that, it seemed different. She was just one of the guys, but did he think of her that way? Did he think of her the way Rhodey and Seth and Jim did? As just one of the guys? Someone to joke around with? No. No, she was pretty sure Colton Colmenares didn't think that way about her. Because he kept looking at her. It was hard to describe, but when Colt looked at her, he looked at her as if he were seeing, well, her. Not just a coworker or one of the guys or even a cowgirl. But her. Anna. She wasn't sure if she liked it. Are there always this many little girls around? She glanced over at Colt to see him looking more than a little apprehensively around at the few preteen girls rushing back and forth. If you think this is bad, you should see it during peak summer. He shot her a look. What? Since school started, these are mostly homeschool groups. Our after-school program starts soon, too. During July, this place is packed to the gills with little girls. There's less in the fall and winter, but there's only a few weeks out of the year when the girls' ranch is really shut down. He was holding his arms close to his body, and Susan was trotting beside him, practically in his shadow. Anna had to grin, it was clear neither of them were particularly comfortable with this many little kids at once. What would he be like as a father? The thought shocked her, causing her to stumble momentarily. Luckily, she caught herself before he noticed, he was still looking around, aghast, anyway. A father? Where had that thought come from? And why did it make her feel icky? The thought of him with some faceless, nameless woman, holding a baby and looking thrilled, hurt her stomach, for some reason. Was it fear? Was she afraid of Colton getting married and having kids? No, that was stupid. She wasn't afraid of him living his life. After all the hands at Cauldron Ranch seemed to be getting married left and right these days. Besides, you're scared of Colt, remember? Except, she wasn't. As she watched him fend off two little girls who wanted to pet Susan, she realized she wasn't afraid of him. It had only been a few days, but he'd been the one to assure her that, despite their size, neither him nor Susan would hurt Anna. And somewhere between him saving her from being knocked down at the dog park, to when he'd allowed her to protect herself when he'd unknowingly grabbed her, to this morning, when he'd brought her coffee and made her want to laugh, she'd began to trust him. Trust him not to hurt her? She frowned. It wasn't that simple. There was a difference between trusting and knowing with absolute certainty he wouldn't hurt her. Wasn't there? There you are, you're certainly looking fierce. Anna looked up to see Val strolling toward them. So she forced a pleasant expression and waved. Just thinking. This is the new ranch hand we just picked up, Colton Colmenares. Colt grinned charmingly and offered his hand. Call me Colt, ma'am, he drawled. Anna tried not to feel jealous. Nice to meet you, Colt. Val hummed lightly and shot Anna a difficult-to-interpret look. You two want to come check out the stables? Shrugging, Anna fell into place beside her old friend. Unless they've changed much since my last visit, I'm assuming they're okay. I just want to look over the specific stalls for these ponies before we deliver them. Well, considering you were just here a few weeks ago, I don't think you'll be too surprised. Val grinned, then glanced at Colt as they walked. She comes and works with us on the weekends during our peak summer season, which is good, because I always need an extra set of hands when it comes to 100 squealing preteen girls and horses. Colt silently gestured for Susan to follow him, and as always, the dog obeyed immediately. Alcatraz tells me you're opening the camps up to boys soon? Val shot Anna another look. Alcatraz? She hummed. Yep, Alcatraz told you correct. We've always been girls only, and empowerment has always been part of our mission. But if we want to preach that girls can do anything boys can do, then we have to make sure they have the same opportunities. Besides, we need the boys to see that the girls can do anything they can do. So going co-ed is the best way to do it. As long as we can figure out how to control hormones, that is. Colt nodded thoughtfully as they stepped into the stables. These are day camps? As long as they're not sleeping in the same cabins or anything, then this shouldn't be any different than school, right? I don't think you'll have trouble mixing the two groups. Val was nodding along. That's what I'm thinking too. These kids are used to going to co-ed schools during the school year, so it shouldn't be any different in the summer. You're pretty smart, Mr. Colt. Did he blush? Was that a blush? Colt glanced down at the dog. Just Colt, ma'am. And Anna reminded herself she couldn't be jealous, because she didn't have any claim on him. None at all. She didn't even like him. Now that's a lie. No, she didn't like him. She was scared of him. You're scared of your reaction to him. Anna scowled, having a feeling her subconscious might just be correct. Pushing past the others, she stomped her way to where the ponies would be kept. Talking about their accommodations, checking in on the other animals, and discussing logistics helped get her mind back where it was supposed to be. By the end of their hour-long meeting, Anna was feeling much more like herself. A cowgirl who was very, very good with horses. A cowgirl who was in control. So, what are you thinking? Val brushed her dirty hands against the seat of her jeans. Does the end of next month still work for the delivery? You bet. Anna did some calculations in her head. I think it'll be late morning before we'll be able to get them all loaded in the trailer and over here. Can you do it in one trip? Nodding, Anna explained, it's why I bought such a big truck, which some people think means I'm overcompensating. She shot a glance at Colt, who held out his hands and grinned. Hey, lady, those were your words, not mine, but the big truck makes sense now. You've got a trailer big enough for all of them? We'll make it work, Anna replied, knowing this was the biggest pony delivery Cauldron Ranch had had in a long time. Colt shrugged. Too bad we're not a little closer. We could wake up early that morning and drive the ponies, like the old days. And risk their health over unknown ground? Anna scowled. These ponies were bred as mounts for little girls. Besides, Alcatraz would have to ride a much bigger horse if she wanted to drive them. Val broke in teasingly, obviously still amused at Anna only using her last name. And I'm sure we all know how she feels about bigger horses. Anna glared. I just like ponies, okay? They're easier to handle. Cough metaphor cough, muttered Colt. Sucking in a gasp, Anna whirled to pierce him with a glare. What did you just say? He said, cough metaphor cough, Val unhelpfully supplied. Maybe he's coming down with a cold. Colt just grinned. You think my preference for smaller horses is a metaphor? Anna demanded, afraid he might be right. She didn't like big anything, even her big truck, but it was a necessity for her job. Besides, she needed a mounting block to mount the bigger horses, which was embarrassing for a real cowgirl to admit. Cough cough yes cough. She frowned. You're saying the word cough. That's stupid. You're not even coughing. Cough sorry cough. Behind them, Val burst into laughter. When Anna whirled back to glare at her friend, Val managed to look chagrined, but she was still smiling when she nodded to Colt. Welcome to the Calendar Ranch. I can see I'm leaving you in good hands. I've got to get back up to the main house, but you should ask an Alcatraz to give you a tour of the place. Anna returned her cheerful wave half-heartedly. See you next week, she called as Val bounced off, still smiling. So, when she turned back to him, Colt had his hand shoved in his pocket, looking almost hopeful, when he asked, could you give me a tour of this place? Somehow, it was impossible to be mad at him. With a sigh, she jerked her head toward the back door, and he followed. Being back at the Calendar Ranch set her at ease in a way she always missed. This place had represented safety when she'd been a kid, and the feeling still pervaded throughout the whole ranch. So as she pointed out the various locations, the main house, the bigger building where most of the classes took place and where the offices were located, and of course the stables, she felt herself relax. And it was cool the way Colt ambled along beside her, asking questions and making quips. It was hard not to laugh sometimes, but she was a cowgirl. She was tough. What's that way? He asked, pointing toward a well-worn path leading to the river. As if he'd given her a command, Susan gave a series of happy barks and tore off in the direction he was pointing. Well, it could be the quicksand pit, so I guess we'll have to go check it out now, Anna said drily. He shot her a worried look. There's not really quicksand though, right? Do I need to call her back? They were already strolling in the direction Susan had raced to when Anna waved away his concerns. Nah, but when we were kids, that had been the rumor. We used to whisper about there being bogs of quicksand hidden around the ranch, but no one knew where they were. Supposedly, some of the older campers knew of a girl who died. In quicksand? He asked. In quicksand. Her lips tugged upward at the memory. I don't know where people get the impression little girls aren't bloodthirsty little savages. They really can be, you know? Actually, I don't. But then he chuckled. So you used to come here as a kid? The path turned to the left, and soon they could hear the river, which was barely a trickle at this time of year. But up ahead came Susan's playful bark, and Anna knew that meant the dog had found the water. Yep, she told Colt, breathing deeply and enjoying the scents of pine, and the river, which had just come into view. I started coming here when I was 12. Just when I needed safety. I only came 4 summers, but they were the best parts of my childhood. He scoffed slightly, heading for one of the boulders the girls jumped from when the river was high, but now, made the best sitting rocks. The best part? Better than Christmases and birthdays and all that? As he settled on the rock, Anna folded her arms across her chest and watched Susan have fun trying to bite the water. The best part, she repeated quietly. I didn't have Christmases and birthdays. He didn't respond, but she knew he was staring at her, probably aghast. So she took a deep breath. My mom brought me up to Montana when I was a baby. I always figured she was running from something, but she never told me. She worked hard, but was killed in a car accident when I was 7. I remember some people came to get me out of school, and I was excited at first. He muttered something which sounded like a curse. Then, I'm sorry, Alcatraz. She didn't look at him, couldn't look at him. When I lived with my mom, we didn't have the money for camps. But then I went into the foster system. I think I was in 4 houses by the time I was 12. She swallowed. I got placed with a couple who didn't have kids. She was a nurse and worked long hours. He was. The memory of Mr. Christopherson's hands and beer-scented breath came rushing back to her, and she forced herself not to shudder. He was big, she finished weakly. Bigger than her. Always bigger than her, and always able to make her do what he wanted her to do, no matter how much she cried and told him he was hurting her. It must have been the movement in the air currents or something, but suddenly, she felt Colt stand up behind her and move to stand right at her shoulder. Blinking the tears from her eyes, she concentrated on Susan's simple joy, forcing herself to breath and let go of the past. Your foster father. Colt cleared his throat. He abused you? Was it that obvious? That easy to guess? He was bigger than me, she repeated, hoping it was an answer he would accept. He was quiet for a long moment, then said, and here, at the ranch, you were safe. That's why you were happy. Right? The tears threatened to clog her throat. Right, she whispered hoarsely. He didn't move, didn't speak for a long time, and she struggled to get her emotions under control. Finally, he cleared his throat. Can I ask you something, Alcatraz? She might have grunted. We're standing out here in the middle of nowhere. There's a pretty river over there, and yeah, the dog is here, but she's not paying us any attention. You and me, we're friends, right? So, why don't you just go ahead and cry? I don't mind. Were they friends? Were they really friends enough for her to cry? Because cowgirls don't cry, she blurted. Well, that's bullshit. When she swung around, incredulous, she realized there were tears in his eyes. Tears. He shrugged, not bothering to hide them. I'm a cowboy, he said simply. And he was crying. Not quite, but almost. Anna blinked, not sure what to say in response. Her nostrils flared as she turned back to the river, trying to figure out why her heart was beating so fast, and why her stomach felt as if she was about to melt into a big pile of goo. After another long moment, during which Susan made it, soaking wet, to the other side of the river and went bounding off, he spoke again. Softly, can I ask you another question? It took her 2 tries to simply whisper, yeah. Can I hold your hand? Can I hold your hand? It was sweet. It was simple. Colt remembered she didn't like to be touched, and he was asking permission. No. No, he couldn't hold her hand. If she let him hold her hand, she might end up asking for a hug too, and once she felt those big, strong arms around her, she'd either melt with desire, or freak the hell out and kick him in the junk the way her self-defense classes taught her. No, he couldn't hold her hand. But what came out of her mouth was, all right. And then, before she could change her mind, and she wasn't even sure if she wanted to change her mind, he'd reached out and enveloped her hand in his big one. She froze, but when she realized that's all he wanted to do, she slowly relaxed. Holding his hand wasn't so bad. In fact, it was nice. Maybe it was the heat of the day, or the fact that it was already mid-morning and the sun was shining brightly. Whatever it was, she slowly felt a warmth spread up her arm from his touch. They stood like that, staring at the empty river, for longer than she could have guessed. Finally, she glanced down at their joined hands, then back up to him. He gave her hand a gentle squeeze, and instead of being frightened by his strength, it was somehow comforting to her. I'm sorry you went through that, he whispered. I wish. His shrug did all sorts of interesting things to his shoulders and chest muscles. If I'd known you back then. You probably weren't even in Cauldron Valley then, she was quick to remind him. And, she released a breath. It didn't last forever. It was actually Mrs. Cauldron Calendar, Val's mom, who figured out what was wrong and called the authorities when I didn't have the cojones to do it. You were a kid, Alcatraz. Don't start believing that you could have stopped it somehow. It was up to the adults to fix it. It wasn't your fault. He sounded exactly like her therapist. How had he known it was the right thing to say? Yeah, I know. She tried for a smile, but knew she failed when she saw the worried look in his eyes. Really, I do. I mean, at the time I didn't. At the time, I thought it was my fault, because that's what he told me. But after he was arrested, and I moved into a group home, I started therapy, and now I've heard it enough times I believe it. Good. He nodded twice, firmly. I'm glad. Not just that you got the therapy, but that you believe it. And because you found something you loved through all that. Oh yeah. She glanced around them, at the natural beauty. This place, the camps and the people, they really meant a lot to me. Though they were different when we were kids, the calendar girls have all grown up and started taking charge, and the ranch is doing amazing work. Val is a few years older than me, but she was the first one to put me on a horse, and I've been in love ever since. His smile was gentle and caring. He was looking at her as if he were genuinely happy for her. And then he squeezed her hand again, and she felt his comfort shooting up her arm. I'm safe here. And I'm safe with him. Colton Colmenares would never, ever hurt her. She suddenly was as certain about that as she was about the earth moving around the sun, the cycles of the moon, and the fact creamy peanut butter was a million times better than crunchy. He'd asked to hold her hand. He hadn't tried to touch her without permission, even something as simple as hand-holding. I really appreciate you telling me this, Alcatraz. It's Anna, she blurted. When his lovely blue eyes widened, she realized what she'd done. But she didn't wince, because she didn't regret it. In fact, telling him her real name made her feel lighter, and even more free than she'd ever felt before. So she took a deep breath and repeated with a nod, my name is Anna. You can call me Anna if you'd like. The crinkles at the corners of his eyes grew as his expression slowly melted into a smile. Then he squeezed her hand once more. In a low voice, he said, I'd be honored. But, she cautioned him with a stern look, don't go bandying that name about please. I've got to maintain my tough reputation. No bandying, got it. But, he met her eyes. You don't mind me using it sometimes? Slowly, hesitantly, she squeezed his fingers. When she did, she saw the excitement jump in his eyes, and felt like smiling. No, I don't think I mind, she finally confessed. His wide lips were sensual, not that she was staring at them or anything, when he finally bowed his head just slightly, and whispered, thank you, Anna. And she felt as if something hard and dark she'd been carrying for years around with her in the pit of her stomach, finally took flight, leaving her free. She smiled. Chapter 6. He didn't touch her again, but it was damned hard. After that morning beside the river on the Calendar Ranch, Colt wanted to take Alcatraz, Anna, in his arms. Wanted to tell her it was okay to cry, that he'd cried plenty, and he'd cry right along with her. But he knew how much bravery it had taken to share what she'd shared. How strong she'd been already, to allow him to hold her hand as she'd explained why her summers on the Calendar Ranch, and the safety they'd offered, had meant so much to her. So he didn't do anything more than hold her hand and ache for her, but he wasn't going to be able to forget about it. He wasn't going to be able to pretend they were just coworkers anymore, not after what he'd learned. Not now, since he'd discovered their backgrounds were so similar. No. He didn't want to forget this. He wanted to take it further. He wanted to see if there was any chance that maybe, someday in the future, she'd see herself the way he saw her. As a strong, capable and beautiful woman. As a clever, brave and talented woman. As a woman worthy of love. Will you have dinner with me? They'd been climbing back into her truck when he'd blurted the question, and when he saw her freeze, he winced. Probably could have been smoother about that, Colmenares. She tilted her head back against the headrest and closed her eyes. She seemed like she was thinking, so Colt twisted in the seat and pretended to be checking on Susan, whose fur was still sticking up in wet patches from her adventure in the river. Finally, Anna, it was so nice to think of her as Anna, and he loved how the simplicity and strength of the name fit her perfectly, took a deep breath. I think I'd like that. Her answer surprised him, but when he snapped his gaze back to her, she was calmly reaching for the key. He studied her as she backed the truck out of the spot and headed for the main road. Are you sure? One of her shoulders hitched upward in a half-shrug. No, I'm not sure. But I think, her expression was carved from stone. I think I trust you, Colt. So yeah, dinner. At my place, he hedged. I'll cook you whatever you want. She took another breath and held it, and he could tell she was deliberating. Finally, as if she were taking a huge leap of faith, she dipped her chin in a simple nod. Yeah. Your place. And he found himself releasing his breath in a grateful sigh. A date. He had a date with Anna Alcatraz, the most intriguing, strongest, and prettiest woman he'd ever met. He was half thrilled, half terrified. But that's why he was determined to make dinner a success. It was now Friday evening, several days after her confession by the river, and in those intervening days, they'd settled into an easy routine as they'd worked together. They were making steady progress with the ponies, and the two of them were now spending the majority of their working hours coming up with ways to test the animals. Even better than working with her was the way she seemed at ease with him now. She no longer shied away from Colt, no longer held herself aloof. She played with Susan, and occasionally, even cracked a joke. Anna would never be called outspoken or even overly friendly by others, but now that he'd gotten to know her, and she'd gotten to know him, she was much more relaxed around him. And Colt was honored she trusted him, but he didn't touch her again. Although it was hard when she knocked on his door that evening. He flung it open and wanted to pull her into his arms. He was just that excited to see her. And maybe he would've, despite his good intentions, had Susan not yipped happily and barreled toward the door to greet her. Colt reacted a second too late, but he still lunged for the dog, trying to stop her before she reached Anna. But to his surprise, the petite woman just stepped out of the way, then held her hand out authoritatively. Drop it, she commanded, and to Colt's surprise, Susan did drop the tennis ball she'd been holding in her massive mouth. Anna's lips curled up as she bent down, picked up the ball, and lobbed it across the yard. With raised brows, Colt found himself leaning against the porch railing, watching them play. After the second throw, she glanced back at him. What? He tried to hide his smile. Nothing. I'm just impressed how well the two of you are getting along now. She shrugged, and he could tell she was a little embarrassed. She's not that bad when you get to know her. Since Anna was very definitely not looking at him, Colt felt himself grin. I have to agree. They both knew she wasn't talking about the dog. So, she demanded. Are you going to show me around? I'd like nothing better. This is the porch. That's the lawn. It needs mowing, but the tractor's busted, and I figured I'd spend some time this weekend trying to figure it out. In the meantime, Susan can just deal with 8-inch weeds. Anna deadpanned, shading her eyes. And what's that there? She pointed. That's the driveway. And there? Her finger moved slightly. That's the shed with the broken tractor. The stables are behind the house. That's the main road. He wasn't even bothering to point, or to hide his growing grin. Over there's some trees. And up there? Her expression was carefully neutral. That's the sky. The fluffy white things are clouds. She hummed again. Great tour, Colton. Thank you. I try. Want to come inside and see the rest of the place? Will that tour be more comprehensive? Heaven help him, but he loved the way her eyes sparkled as she teased, even though her tone and expression were completely stoic. Possibly, though I can't promise it'll be more interesting. Anna rested her hands on her hips and took a moment to glance around, porch, lawn, road, trees, sky. Finally, she nodded. I think it will be. He burst out laughing. Her sense of humor was so dry, it was a fire hazard. But he loved it all the same. Come in, and then you can help me cut the toppings for the salad. I wasn't sure what you liked. She shrugged. I'm cool with anything. What's for dinner? Burgers. I thought. When Anna patted her palm against her thigh and Susan came running, Colt realized he'd stopped talking. When had she started doing that? Anna was using his signals for the trained dog, and Susan was responding. It was as if they'd always belonged together. Catching himself before she realized his blunder, Colt shook his head. Burgers. Right. He held the door open for her and the dog, then followed them inside. Do you want dinner or the tour first? Oh, the tour, Anna said quietly, glancing around. So he showed her around. It was an older house, only 4 bedrooms and 2 baths, and he knew it needed updating, but it was livable, and the big fireplace in the living room gave it plenty of character. Besides, he'd bought it for the property, not so much for the house. Still, Anna seemed impressed. There's a lot of potential here, Colt. The second bedroom is huge, so you could divide it into 2 smaller rooms if you ever needed to, and frame in a closet here. She trailed him into the living space. And you could always knock out part of this wall, you'd have to leave this support here, to open up the space between the living and dining room. He was impressed. I'd considered doing that actually, somewhere down the line. This place was built when it was common to shut the kitchen off from the rest of the house. She nodded. Yep, because when you had dinner parties in the 50s, you'd want to shut the door to the kitchen so no one saw how messy it was to cook for 10 people. Now we've got enough appliances like dishwashers and warmers and microwaves, so the open floor plan works. You do have a dishwasher in this antique, don't you? Chuckling, he shrugged. The last owner installed it, but I don't usually bother since it's just me to cook for, and Susan helps me lick the plates clean. She really was adorable when she wrinkled her nose like that and glanced at the dog, as if trying to determine if he was telling the truth. He took pity on her. Come on into my shut-off kitchen and help me chop veggies. When she entered, he liked the way she peered into all the corners, as if getting a feel for the place, but then settled at the counter to cut up cucumbers, carrots, and tomatoes to put on top of the spring mix. So what did you say was for dinner, besides the salad? He pulled a plate out of the fridge. I made up some of my famous burgers, and the mac and cheese is in the oven. Her brows rose, which was practically a shout, coming from her, and her hand paused, knife raised. You made mac and cheese, from scratch? It seemed important to her, so he nodded. Yeah. That's the best way. Mrs. Cipher, the lady who ran the Cipher range where I stayed during high school, taught me her recipe. After a long moment, Anna's nostrils flared, and she slowly started chopping again. I love homemade mac and cheese. That was all she had to say for Colt to vow to make her as much of the side dish as she could stand. Tell me about these famous burgers. They're made of beef. I put onions and seasoning and some shredded cheddar in them. Her eye roll was subtle. This isn't going to turn into another bland tour, is it? I meant, what makes them famous? She was beginning to appreciate his sense of humor, he was certain. Well, whenever I make them, people seem to like them. Her lips twitched. Then I'm sure I will too. Having her in his kitchen, in his home, it felt right. He'd worked hard since his return to the States to build this place into a real home. And her sitting here in the kitchen, helping him make dinner, felt like the final piece had been put into the place. Yeah, dinner with Anna Alcatraz was turning into the best idea ever. Dinner with Colton Colmenares wasn't so bad after all. Sure, Anna had been nervous as hell over the idea of a real date since he'd invited her, but, after the way he'd held her hand, after the understanding in his eyes, after the warmth she'd felt from his touch, how could she not? And she had to admit, seeing his ranch, seeing the effort and love he'd put into making this place a home, was amazing. While he grilled the burgers on the back porch, she and Susan wandered into the stables and met his horses. The place was immaculate. It was obvious he'd focused on the animals' comfort before his own, and she liked seeing how he'd arranged everything. She ambled back in time to see him taking the burgers off the grill. He was smiling, which made her stomach flip over. Colt smiled a lot, and each and every time, dimple. Crooked tooth, it made her insides go a little melty. See anything you like? He asked nonchalantly. She was looking at him, and oh yeah, she saw plenty she liked. But she shrugged. You're obviously building an impressive empire. Chuckling, he lowered the lid to the grill. I dunno about that. I'd be happy with a small herd, just enough to be profitable. Maybe build up from there over the years. Or, he shrugged as he lifted his gaze to the horizon. I dunno. I know there's a lot of good that can be done for kids who need it out here. Like Calendar Ranch or Cipher Range. Maybe one day I can do something like that. He wanted to help kids? The way the calendars had helped her and countless other little girls? Anna swallowed down the lump in her throat and told her heart to quit beating quite so hard. It didn't work. They were sitting down to dinner, the mac and cheese smelled muy delicioso, when she said, "Tell me about Cipher Range. You've mentioned it before." He focused on scooping salad onto his plate. What do you want to know about it? You said you lived there during your high school years. Yep. His smile flashed at her as he was in the process of reaching for the serving spoon for the mac and cheese. It was a foster home run by the sweet older lady named Mrs. Cipher. There were boys there, older than me, who showed us younger ones the ropes. It was a working ranch. Fascinated, Anna was only half paying attention to her food when she lifted a forkful of mac and cheese to her waiting mouth, but soon after the food hit her taste buds, her eyes widened. Dios mío, this is amazing. Her gaze darted to her plate. You have a real talent. Worthy of taking the Lord's name in vain? He chuckled, shaking his head, and she knew he was teasing. Like I said, it's Mrs. Cipher's recipe. She propped one elbow on the counter, to hell with manners, and started eating in earnest. Tell me about Cipher Range. How'd you end up there? In between bites, he told her about his history, how he'd never known his parents, but a relative had dropped him off at a police station when he'd been 4, and then how he had been in and out of group home and foster situations. There was a hesitation when he mentioned how he moved from foster home to foster home, but then he rushed through it, as if he wanted to get it all said. With a deep breath, he rolled his shoulders, then his neck. After that, I became known as somewhat of a problem kid. With all the shit I went through, I tended to start fights, which wasn't popular with the adults. My therapists kept trying to talk me through it, but I just wanted to punch something. Anna eyed his shoulders and wondered how that had ended. As if he could understand her thoughts, he grinned sheepishly. I know. Eventually, I landed at Cipher Range, as a sort of last-ditch placement. Mrs. Cipher took in all sorts of boys, and it's not like I was the worst. But suddenly, I found out that my muscles were good for something besides fighting back against the world. It was a working ranch, you said? It was amazing how similar their childhoods were, and how differently they'd turned out. He was big enough to fight back against people who tried to hurt him. That was important. Yep. One of my foster brothers, Kemper, used to joke that I was big enough to wrestle a bull. Are you sure it was a joke? She asked blandly. He bit into his burger with a shrug. Nope. Well, after seeing the horses you keep here, I'm extra glad I didn't let you ride any of my ponies over the last week. You'd have crushed the poor things. Likely smushed them flat, he agreed. So that's how you started ranching? Before he could answer, she pointed her fork at her empty plate. This mac and cheese is seriously the best I've ever had. You're a really good cook. Chuckling, he pushed the serving dish her way. Have some more. I'll make another batch next time. No way. She shook her head as she reached for the dish. I'll cook next time. I make empanadas that'll make you moan. Excellent. I have a soft spot for empanadas. When she glanced up, his gaze caught hers and held it. There was a warmth there, a sincerity, which made her swallow down a whimper. It wasn't just her body's reaction to this man which confused her, but the way he made her feel about herself. That's when she realized how casually she'd agreed to a second date. But she couldn't regret it. The idea of spending time with him like this in the future made her want to smile. The idea of a future with him made her want to smile. So, ranching, she managed to croak. One of his shoulders lifted in a casual sort of move. Yep. I was good with horses, I discovered, just like you learned at the Calendar Ranch. But being in one place for so long meant stability, which meant I could join the football team. I wasn't the best player, but I made some great friends. Like whom? She asked eagerly, thinking of the girls she'd met at the Calendar Ranch. Don Weston was probably the guy I was closest to, outside of my foster brothers. He grew up over in Black Aces, but zoning meant we were on the same team. Don Weston, I met him at Rhodey's wedding. He's Rhodey's brother-in-law, isn't he? Yeah, drawled Colt. 5 of his sisters married cowboys from Cauldron Ranch, so he was the one who suggested I approach Jim and ask for a temporary job. Anna smiled. I'm glad you did. It wasn't until he froze, eyes wide, that she realized what she'd said. Why, Ms. Alcatraz, he drawled, are you saying you like working with me? She liked more than just working with him, but Anna wasn't about to admit that. You're not as bad as I thought you were. Like Susan. You warmed up to her pretty quick. At the sound of her name, the dog perked up from her bed, probably thinking it was time to lick the dishes, but he gave her the hand signal to stand down. And she's a good friend. Yeah, she's all right too, Anna drawled with a straight face, teasing him. And now that you've started playing with her, you know she's not going to hurt you. He was pushing the metaphor, but she had to admit he was right. At some point since he'd come to work at Cauldron Valley, she'd learned to trust him, and she'd also learned touching him wasn't so bad. In fact, he hadn't touched her since that day beside the river, and she missed it. Since then, she'd found herself wondering what it would be like to be held by someone as strong as him, someone who would protect rather than hurt. There'd been a moment there by the river when she'd been fighting her tears, and she'd wanted him to wrap her up safely and tell her everything would be okay. She'd wanted him to touch her. Now, she glanced down at his hand resting beside his water glass. He'd asked her permission before to hold her hand. He'd understood her hesitation and had given her the control. But she could do it this time. She could make the move. She would. Her hand only trembled slightly as she reached across the table and covered his. They both let out a breath when their skin touched, and then slowly, he twined his fingers through hers. When she looked up, Anna saw he was smiling, and she smiled back. It felt right. There, he whispered. I'm just as nice as Susan is. I don't bite, and I even smell better. Such a silly comment, after the tension of the moment, caught Anna by surprise. Her laughter, awkward and startled, burst from her lips before she could stop it. His eyes widened. Is that all it took? Insulting my dog? Because I could tell you about the time she ran into a skunk, and I had to treat her with tomato soup, because I didn't have any juice. So it was way goopier than it should have been, and when she reached around to groom herself mid-tomato soup treatment, she spread that stuff all over herself. Anna began to giggle as he continued, my house smelled weird as hell for a bit. I couldn't decide between lighting candles to cover the skunk stench or making myself some grilled cheese sandwiches to go with the tomato soup scent. It was ridiculous. It was preposterous. It was perfect. Anna couldn't seem to stop giggling, even though it wasn't all that funny. It was just, after so long of holding herself in, of being strong, it felt good to let herself be free. To laugh. He was beaming as he watched her, still holding her hand across the table. You have the most wonderful laugh, Anna, he murmured. Well, that shut her up. He must have seen her embarrassed blush, because he squeezed her fingers. It was a compliment. I want to make you laugh more. Well, she mumbled, staring down at her plate, apparently all you have to do is tell me silly stories about your dog. Deal. How about the time she was in training and they didn't have the right-sized harness for her, and the thing dragged under her belly? She kept coming back with stuff stuck inside there. One time. As she listened, Anna felt a sense of peace settle into her chest. The stories were silly and ranged from Susan's time in Afghanistan to Colt's stories about his time at Cipher Range and the messes he and his foster brothers got into, and everything in between. She loved hearing about his time on the ranch, and the friendships he'd made there, and yeah, she even laughed a few more times. When she did, he beamed as if he'd won the lottery, which made her feel self-conscious and flattered all at once. It was the best evening of her life. Chapter 7. Yeah, Colt was definitely falling in love. If he'd thought about it, at any point in his life, he wouldn't have guessed this was how he'd fall in love. But Anna Alcatraz was everything he hadn't realized he wanted in his life, strong and fierce, with a biting wit which made him laugh. The fact she was sexy enough to make his blood boil, and made killer empanadas, well, those were just added bonuses. In the weeks following their first date, Colt found excuses almost every night to spend time with Anna, sometimes at his place, sometimes at hers, and sometimes they went out for dinner at dog-friendly restaurants. On the weekends, he offered to take her up to Helena or someplace fun for a real date, but instead, she offered to come help on his ranch. How could he pass that up? "You're sure you don't mind helping me out? Wouldn't you rather go do something fun instead?" "Nah," she answered with a snort. "I'll deal with the horses, you keep working on that stupid lawnmower." "I'm short, remember?" He frowned, trying to figure out her point. "So what?" "Well, right now, the weeds in your front lawn come up to my knees. If you go another week without mowing, they're going to be up to my crotch, and I'm not going to be able to move. I'll sit right there in the middle," she pointed, "and you're going to have to send Susan out to rescue me." "Woof. Yes you, Susan. You'd rescue me, wouldn't you?" When the dog nosed against her, Anna didn't shy away, but rather, planted her weight and scratched Susan behind the ears. "You're a good puppy, aren't you?" "Woof." Colton had to laugh. "So how's that whole I only want a small dog thing going, Anna?" She stuck her tongue out at him. He'd managed to get the lawnmower fixed, thanks to some how-to videos online, a crescent wrench, and plenty of elbow grease. And, he reflected, staring down at his ruined t-shirt, regular grease too. Anna smirked when she saw him. "You want an apron?" "An apron?" "Sure. You know, the things ladies wear over their dresses to keep their clothes clean? You could wash that instead of ruining your clothes." He pretended to think about it while wiping his hands on a rag. It's a novel idea, certainly. You're saying I should try to get less grease on my clothes?" "I'm saying that if I'd gotten that much grease on me, I'd probably drown." Hiding his smile, Colt offered a long-suffering sigh. "Drowning in grease and up to your crotch in weeds. I had no idea my ranch was so dangerous to a tiny little cowgirl." "I'm not tiny." She lifted her chin with a mulish look, although her eyes were twinkling. "I'm fun-sized." Yes, she was. Actually, it was taking all of Colt's willpower not to scoop her up in his arms and spin her around. As it was, he took a step toward her, his arms held out invitingly. "You know, if I hugged you right now, my chest would be just at the right height to give you a face full of grease." With a shriek, Anna turned and ran. But she didn't sound scared, she sounded more like she was teasing him. So with a growl, Colt lowered his head and ran after her. She was laughing as she ducked and wove around obstacles, staying a few steps ahead of him. Of course, his legs were long enough to easily overtake her, but he wouldn't do that to her. Instead, he let her stay just out of reach, growling and threatening her with a dirty face, as Susan barked and nipped at her heels, and Anna shrieked and laughed. It made his heart so damn happy to hear that sound and to know he'd caused it. It wasn't until they'd reached the side steps up to the front porch, where he knew there were 2 loose nails, that he lunged forward and caught her hand. From the way she sucked in a breath as he spun her around, she hadn't expected that. It would have been so easy to tug her against him and take her into his arms, but at the last moment, he held off, and it wasn't because of the grease on his shirt. She stood there, chest heaving from her run, her overall expression calm, but her eyes were suddenly wary. And he knew he wasn't going to force her into any more touching than she was comfortable with. So instead, he smiled easily and twined his fingers through hers. They fit together so well, despite their relative size differences. When he winked at her, her expression eased into a sheepish smile. Then he lifted her hand, holding her gaze the entire time. If she so much as flinched, he'd stop what he was doing. But she didn't. Her breathing was coming faster, and her eyes locked on his and were full of what he swore was anticipation. His lips brushed across the skin on the back of her fingers, and all the tension seemed to exit her body with her breath as she sighed. It was enough. For now. The following day, after he finished mowing the front yard, Anna returned to his ranch. Together, they made a picnic lunch and strapped the flexible cooler to the back of one of his horses. He only had the 3, but they were good animals. Even though Anna had met and cared for them all, she still grumbled about their size. He liked the way she wasn't nervous around them and knew exactly how to handle the gelding who snapped at her hat. "Stop that," she snapped, as she pushed at his nose, which soon turned into a pat. "Fine, I'll ride you." "That's the one you want?" Colt was surprised, the third horse was smaller. But she just sighed and rolled her eyes. "I can't hurt his feelings by leaving him behind, can I? Looks like he chose me anyway." Colt didn't mind one bit, because he didn't have a mounting block, and that meant she'd need his help. Remembering the day they'd met at the dog park, he only hesitated a moment before wrapping his hands around her waist and lifting her up. And to his surprise, she didn't stiffen against his hold, but just settled into the saddle as if she'd been born there. "I'll have to get a mounting block, or some smaller horses, once she moves in." The thought, coming so naturally as he swung up into the saddle, froze him in place. He was thinking not just of a future with Anna, but a future at his home, a future where she was living with him. Slowly, he settled himself and bemusedly nudged his horse into following her out of the yard, thinking about what this meant. He wasn't just thinking about a potential future with her, he was thinking about marrying her. Well, why not? She was incredible and everything he hadn't known he'd wanted. And now, he wanted her here with him, helping to build this place into a success. With that in mind, he steered the conversation during the picnic toward the future of the ranch and listened intently as she made suggestions. They were good, though half of them he'd thought of already, but the rest were novel. And it sounded as if she were on board with some of his more nebulous plans, such as the idea of making this into a working ranch and then a happy and safe place for kids. Or maybe. As Susan chased a rabbit over the hill, Colt suddenly smiled up at the sunlight dappling the branches above where he and Anna rested on a blanket under a tree. "Foster kids," he blurted. She hummed in question, and he found himself suddenly feeling awkward. He sat up and rubbed at the back of his neck. I was just thinking, once this place is up and running, or maybe even before that, I just thought," he shrugged. "I thought about maybe turning this place into something like Cipher Range." Anna was watching him, hands clasped around her knees. "You mean a foster home? You want to foster boys like Mrs. Cipher did for you and your brothers?" "Boys, girls, whatever." He offered a sheepish smile. "I think little cowgirls could enjoy this place as much as little cowboys." To his surprise, she glanced away, looking off over the meadow. He thought she would have smiled, or at least appreciated his acknowledgement she was just as capable as any man when it came to her job. But instead, after a long moment, she nodded. In a quiet voice, she said, "I think that's a really good idea, Colton. You'd make a wonderful foster parent with your background." "Hey." When she didn't look his way, he reached over and snagged her hand. She didn't tense up, but she didn't look at him either. "Anna, you would too. I know the foster system really failed you." "No." Her gaze snapped to his, and he saw nothing but sincerity in the depths of her light brown eyes. "No, it was just him. The other families I lived with, and the group homes I was placed in after the authorities found out what Mr. Christopherson had done," she shook her head. "They were fine. They were good people." He nodded, understanding her defense. "Yeah, mostly my people were good too. But I'm saying that, since we've seen the good and the bad, we know how to be the good ones." This place, still holding her hand, he glanced around the ranch, imagining the way it could be in a few years. This place could be really good for the kids who need the space and responsibility and direction. "You're right." When he met her eyes again, she smiled, but it wasn't quite convincing. "You'd need to build onto the house a bit or subdivide those rooms we talked about. But you could make this place an epic foster home." "No," he softly corrected, squeezing her hand. "A regular home. We could make this a home." She must have heard the "we" in his words, because she flushed and looked down at her knees. But it only made him smile. "Anna, all I need is a cowgirl to help me make this ranch a success." She didn't answer, but he saw her swallow and close her eyes. Was that a good sign or a bad one? Either way, he wasn't discouraged, because one thing was very clear. He was in love with Anna Alcatraz and was determined to make her his wife. Together, they'd build this ranch into a home. Chapter 8. The day was fast approaching when the ponies would be dropped off at the Calendar Ranch. And when that happened, Colt would no longer be her partner. He'd no longer have a reason to work with her. But still, it was impossible not to feel grateful for the time they've had together. And he'd still be working at Cauldron Ranch, even if Jim assigned him to a different job once the ponies were delivered. She'd get to see him, so that would be nice. Who are you kidding? You've been seeing him almost every noche. The thought made her feel a little better, especially when, the day before delivery, Jim asked Colt to handle a particularly large Mustang which had just come in, and Anna had to pop over to the Calendar Ranch to double-check on accommodations. You're going over to his house for dinner tomorrow, remember? Just because their job would be over soon, didn't mean she'd never see him again or anything. But maybe she was a little bit grumpier than usual when she showed up at the Calendar Ranch. What's gotta be in your bonnet? Val asked when Anna stomped into the stables. Anna's head reared back as she regarded her friend. What bonnet? What does that mean? Is there a bee? She glanced around, warily. But Val chuckled and waved away the distraction. Sorry, never mind. You're here to plan for tomorrow, I assume? When Anna nodded, trying to remember this was about business, Val led her toward the tack room where they went over the plan. Soon, the two cowgirls had settled into an easy repertoire, which reminded Anna of their younger days. It was nice to be able to work with Val again, and she could appreciate her friend's sense of humor, even if she didn't always show it. However, after one particularly stupid joke, right as they finished up, Val pointed a long finger her way. Aha! I knew it. Anna raised a brow. Knew what? That was a smile. You smiled, Anna. And I would bet money you were close to laughing one time. Lips twitching, Anna tried to deny it. One time? I've been known to laugh. More than once. Wrong. I don't remember you laughing ever, her friend assured her, peering closely. Are you sick? Do you have a fever? Is it the pandemic? What pandemic? Val shrugged. Mom's always going on about the pandemic. We have to wash our feet, or we'll catch the pandemic. No nose picking, or we'll catch the pandemic. Sleep with garlic under our pillows, or we'll catch the pandemic. Is the pandemic code for vampires? Anna wrinkled her nose. But I think the no nose picking is probably good advice, pandemic or not. I don't know, but my sheets always smell like Italian food, thanks to her. This time Anna snorted, and Val crowed. A laugh. You laugh, what's up with you? She peered closer. It's that cowboy you've been working with, isn't it? Colton? I thought you seemed happier around him. And just like that, Anna's good mood evaporated. The reminder she had fun with Colt, and that their project together would soon be over, sent her back into her funk. Okay, Val blew out a breath. Come on a walk with me and tell me. It was hard, but Val was her friend. Not only that, but because she didn't work at Cauldron Ranch, Val was fairly impartial, and Anna trusted her. Still, it was hard to start. Colt, well, I didn't like him at first, because of his size. It wasn't a question. Val might not know all of Anna's past, but she'd likely guessed at least the majority of it. So Anna just hummed. And you saw that dog of his? I actually met Susan before I met him, and yeah, I was cautious around her. And him? Before Anna could answer, her friend continued, you know, you can say scared. You're allowed to be scared. Cowgirls don't get scared. It was the same mantra Anna had repeated to herself for years. But Val snorted. Well, that's bullshit. I'm scared of plenty of things. Bullshit, that's what Colt had said too, now that she thought about it. Before Anna could come up with something to say, Val shook her head. Okay, weird preconceived notions about what a cowgirl should and shouldn't do and feel aside, let's get back to Colt. You didn't like him at first, but... Sighing, Anna shoved her hands in her pockets as they strolled past the main building. But he's hard not to like. He's always so cheerful. And he's big, sure, but he wouldn't hurt me. I know that now. Val waved at one of her sisters, who was herding a half-dozen girls, toward the dining room. Are you seeing him outside of work? Yeah, pretty often actually. And Anna found herself telling her friend all about Colt's ranch, and his plans for it. She talked about how she'd helped him there and how well they worked together, and how their dinners were always fun. Val hummed speculatively. Sounds like you really like this guy, Anna. He does know your name is Anna, right? When he was here last time. Yeah, he knows. Anna cleared her throat. He knows everything about me. Ah. From her tone, Val understood how hard it had been for Anna to confess her past. And do you know everything about him? Did she? Anna frowned, considering. She knew about his childhood in foster care, same as hers, and his experience at Cipher Range. And how he'd finally settled down, and how the army had built on the discipline he'd learned from his high school football coach. He'd told her everything, hadn't he? I think so. And you like him? It wasn't a question, but Anna nodded. I think I really do. Do you love him? This wasn't as easy to answer. I'm not sure. With a sigh, Val slipped into the shadow of one of the tall pines surrounding her home. She reached out and brushed her fingertips across Anna's shoulder, but knowing her preferences, her touch didn't linger. Still, it pulled Anna into the shadows off the path with her. What is it, Anna? Val asked softly. What is churning around in that tiny head of yours? He wants to turn his ranch into a foster home, Anna blurted. And he said he needed a cowgirl to do it with him. And he was looking at me when he said it. Wow, she hadn't even realized that was what had been bothering her, until the words came tumbling out. But her friend was watching her, her head cocked to one side so her blonde braid fell over one shoulder. That sounds an awful lot like, she shrugged. Well, it sounds like, if you're interpreting it correctly, that Colton wants a future with you. That's what she was afraid of. Wincing, Anna pulled her hands from her pocket and looked down at them. What if I can't, she whispered. I don't know how to be whatever it is he wants me to be. Anna, her friend said gently, if he asks you to be part of his future, specifically, a wife, then that means he wants you to be exactly who you are right now. It took a moment for the words to sink in, but when they did, Anna looked up. You think so? She didn't bother hiding the hopeful tone in her voice. Oh honey. Val moved as if she wanted to hug Anna, but halted the motion and sighed instead. Yes. I don't know why this is so hard for you to believe, but he could easily love you for who you are. You're brave and interesting and determined, and a damned good cowgirl. Love you. Colt could love her? The thought was terrifying, yet made her feel giddy as well. Anna felt her heart thumping louder. She took a deep breath. I think I might like that. To be loved by him? Yes. But also, to help him build his ranch into a home. A successful ranch too. One corner of her lips twitched. I am, after all, a damned good cowgirl. Yes, Val agreed softly, and even cowgirls are allowed to have emotions, you know. We get scared, we get angry, and most importantly, we love. When a cowgirl loves, she loves with all her heart. Remember that. All my heart. Was it possible she was in love with Colt already? See. The answer came with a blinding burst of certainty, which had her lips pulling up into a broad smile. Val chuckled. Well, that seemed important. You just realized you love him, didn't you? See. And then Anna laughed. See. I love him. Val's fist pumped in the air. Awesome. Are you going to tell him? Oh. Well, that's a scary proposition. And that was one fear, as a cowgirl, she didn't mind admitting. Chuckling, her friend nodded. I get that. Okay, so let him make the first move. But, she jabbed one finger at Anna's chest, stopping short of touching her. You'd better think about what you're going to say to him if he starts mentioning a future with you, Missy. You're a good cowgirl, sure, but you'd also make a good foster mother. Remember what you were like when you came to this place? Eyes wide, Anna whispered, I do. Every day. Your family saved me. Well, Val shrugged. You could be that for some little girl. And you'd be able to do it with a man you love. What could be better? It was terrifying. It was wonderful. It was breathtaking, but Anna knew, with sudden clarity, that she could do it. If he asked, she could build a future with Colt. Hey, man, you got a minute? It felt weird to Colt to be calling out of the blue like this. On the other end of the line, his foster brother snorted. Absolutely. You calling to tell me you'll be home for Thanksgiving? Don't give me that grief, Kemper. I live maybe 40 minutes away. You saw me last month. Colt could imagine Kemp's slow grin, and the way the man would be stretching his booted feet out and crossing his ankles when he drawled, well, now, don't think we didn't miss the fact you didn't show up last weekend, which was when we'd all planned on getting together. The guys who still ran Cypher Range hosted a big barbecue on one Sunday afternoon each month, no matter the weather. All of the alumni, which is what they called their foster brothers who hadn't stuck around, were welcome to return. It wasn't that Colt had forgotten exactly, it was just that he'd had other things on his mind. And in his home. Yeah, well, about that, he mumbled. Kemp snorted again. Here come the excuses. The guys and I will accept A, you were in the hospital, B, you were getting engaged, or C, your fiancé was in the hospital. Man, you're strict. But Colt grinned. Those are really the only excuses you'd accept? Hey, man, we had to go years without seeing you while you were off being a hero on the other side of the world. Then you return, but you bring a female dog with you instead of a pretty woman. Do you want some pointers? I could have Hunter or Luke jot down some suggestions about how to ask out a. I don't need any, Colt interrupted, torn between embarrassment and laughter. And I can't believe you're going all big brother on me, when you don't bring dates to these get-togethers. How do you know? Kemper shot back. You didn't show up last time. Chuckling now, Colt climbed out of his truck and signaled Susan to jump out too. Look, if I bring a girl next month, will you lay off me? His foster brother's tone turned serious. If you're serious about a girl, I hope you'd bring her home to meet your family before then. Family? Yeah. Kemp and the other guys, they were his family, weren't they? The only one he had, really. Until Anna says yes. But, would she? That was the question. He knew her past. He knew what she'd been through, and why she was so prickly. That just made him love her more, but could she ever learn to love him? They hadn't even kissed yet. But the way his body reacted to hers, he knew they weren't going to have any trouble in that department. Hey, Earth to Colton. I didn't stop what I was doing just so I could pick up the phone and listen to you breathe. Colt jerked, realizing he'd been staring at the horizon. Sorry. What were you in the middle of? I interrupted you, want to call me back when you're done? Nah, the other man drawled, I was just going over projected numbers for next quarter. I think the ranch will manage to stay afloat for the time it takes me to talk to my favorite brother. Favorite? Colt snorted. I'm going to tell the guys you said that. Better move all the breakable stuff out of the way before the next barbecue. Because some punches would be thrown. No, you won't, and I'll tell you why. Kemp was smirking, Colt could hear it in his voice. Because you're going to swear never to mention that, and I'll swear to lay off on bugging you about bringing a girl home every once in a while. I don't believe you. I swear it on Mrs. Cypher's head. Well, that was as good as gold, as far as the boys from Cypher Range were concerned. All right then. And I'm glad to hear the ranch is doing well, you know it. Kemper sounded proud, and as well he should. He'd been at Cypher Range longer than the others and was sort of their leader. "How's yours going? How's the job at Cauldron Ranch going?" "I'm still ticked you didn't come back to work for us." "I didn't come back to work for you because you don't have the money to pay me yet. Maybe when Cypher Range is in its third generation of making money, you can get generous." Kemper chuckled. "You're right. So, how's the money making going?" "The paychecks are great. I'm socking it all away, like my big brother taught me, and I'll be able to afford a herd soon enough, I reckon." "Excellent. Glad to hear you've been paying attention. And glad to hear they treat you right. Are they as much fun to work with as we are?" Remembering the practical jokes, good-natured brawls, long-standing grudges, and all the shenanigans at Cypher Range, Colt had to chuckle. "Less exciting, that's for sure. But..." His brother knew him well. "But what?" Colt took a deep breath, his gaze scanning the small ranch he called his own, which he was determined to build into a success. "But there's this Cowgirl woman. Anna. She's amazing. Colton Colmenares." It sounded as if Kemp's boots hit the floor, and Colt imagined him sitting upright. "Did you call me up to tell me about a woman? Why in the utter hell didn't you start with that, man?" "Oh hi, Kemp, how are you? How's the ranch? Let me listen to you tease me about dating, haha, business is great, and oh, by the way, I met a woman I really like and want to marry." Colt winced. "You got all that out of the little I said?" His brother sucked in a breath. "So you do want to marry her?" "Huh." And that's when Colt realized what he'd just confessed. But, it was true. "Yeah." He rolled his shoulders, then his neck. "Yeah, I do want to marry her. That's why I called you." "Want to be my best man?" There was silence from the other end of the phone. Then, quietly, he heard, "You're serious?" "I am. I've only known her for a short time, and I don't know what she'll say when I ask her for real. But I love her. I think she's amazing, and I think you'll like her too." Kemp whistled, long and low. Colt could imagine him shaking his head when he drawled, "Well, all right then. Yeah, you know the guys will all love her, once you get around to introducing her to us." "You really want me to be your best man? Not Don?" Suddenly feeling awkward, Colt shrugged. "You're my brother," he said simply, and luckily, Kemp understood. "You haven't asked her? You haven't proposed yet? Are you getting a ring?" "I don't think that would work with her." Colt hadn't really planned all this out yet, but as he explained to his foster brother, certain things became clear. "She's prickly. I love her, and I think she might love me, or at least, I think she'd be able to learn to love me." He hadn't done anything more than hold her hand, after all. "If she agrees, we probably won't even think about taking the next step beyond a long engagement for a while." If she didn't like to be touched, how was he supposed to kiss her? Make love to her? And if there was one thing Colt knew, it's that he very much wanted to make love to Anna. On the other end of the line, Kemp cleared his throat. "You know your own mind best, man. We'll support you, whatever happens, and if she says yes, well then, I'd be proud to stand up next to you when you say your I dos. And I've got my fingers crossed for you." Colt blew out a breath and dragged his hand through his hair. "Thanks. I'll need it. When are you going to ask?" Chuckling, Colt shook his head. "Nah, you don't get it. I have to move slow with Anna. It'll take me a while to work up to that point. There's an order of operations to these things. Maybe a kiss first, then, I love you, before finally, eventually, will you marry me?" That was probably months away. "Well, you've gotta start sometime," Kemper reminded him. Tomorrow was the day they'd deliver the ponies. After that, theoretically, Colt wouldn't be working with her anymore. Jim Cauldron could reassign him. Colt would still see Anna in the evenings and after work, but they won't be together during the day all the time anymore. If he wanted to start on the long order of operations, which might eventually lead to, "Will you marry me?" he needed to say something tomorrow. "You're right." He nodded. "Tomorrow. After we deliver, well, tomorrow, I'll pull her aside and talk to her, but not ask her to marry you? Man, these things take time. Kemp chuckled. Okay, how about inviting her home to meet your family? Colt considered. Yeah, I could do that. That might be a good first step. Glad I could be of service, little bro. Now, go out there and kick butt. Let me know how it goes. Smiling, Colt nodded. Deal. Say hello to the guys for me. Roger that. Give that slobbery dog of yours a kiss for me, with lots of tongue. Colt was chuckling when he hung up, and while he didn't actually kiss Susan, nor give her any tongue, he did give her an extra pat as they headed for the house. There was an unexpected spring in his step. Tomorrow. Tomorrow he'd tell Anna how he felt about her. He'd tell her about his past, and about why his future was so important. The future he wanted to share with her. Tomorrow. Chapter 9. She was sad to see the ponies go, and not just because it meant the end of her time working with Colt. No, it was that, but also because she'd spent so long training these animals, and felt as if she knew them. Oh well, I can always visit. Val Callender tended to call her when they needed an extra hand during the summer weekends anyhow, so Anna perked up a little, knowing it's not as if she'd never see them again. Besides, the chaos and excitement of delivering horses never failed to lift her spirits. It was fun. Whoa there, get on up, sunshine. Seeing Colt pull off his hat to swat at the rear of one of the ponies, Anna hid her smirk. Don't you know what's good for you, horse? All you gotta do is climb in and settle down. There you go. Who's a good girl? Susan, keep that one in place, would you? The three of them got the last of the ponies loaded correctly, and Anna climbed down out of the trailer. Colt was slumped against the metal frame, still holding his hat. Phew, he declared, wiping at his forehead with the back of one forearm. We make a pretty good team, yep. Her lips twitched as she checked the lock. You yell the poor animals into submission, while Susan and I get the work done. Luckily, he knew her well enough now to know when she was teasing, dry as it was. So he chuckled, before settling into an easy grin. Nothing you can say is going to ruin my good mood today, Anna. I'm feeling as if you and I together could do anything. Just imagine. After we're married and you move out to my ranch, we're going to kick butt. If the two of us put our minds to it, I'll bet the place would be turning a profit in under. When he bit off the rest of his words, she turned to catch his wince. It was only then that she realized what he'd been in the process of saying. He was talking about a future, marriage even, with her. And she wanted to hear more about it. What? She prompted. He winced again, then dragged his hand through his dark curls. Sorry, Anna. I had a plan, and here I go, jumping all over the place. So much for my order of operations. Well, now she was intrigued, and more than a little excited. What order of operations? With a sigh, he jammed his hat back on his head. I had it all figured out, sweetheart. He held up 3 fingers. First, I convince you I'm really not so bad, and you should let me kiss you. Second, I tell you I love you. Third, I ask you to marry me. He rolled his eyes and dropped his hand to his hip. And here I go, blurting it out of order. Out of order? Her mind was reeling at his casual admissions. You blurted all of it out. He'd blurted out he wanted to kiss her, and he wanted to marry her. And he loves you. She was having trouble breathing. Why? The thought of him possibly feeling the same way she did about him had her feeling excitement, sure, but also, the old fear was back and was currently clawing its way up her throat. Unable to form a coherent response, Anna groped for the side of the trailer, looking for something, anything, stable to ground herself with as her mind was reeling. Let's just finish the job, she croaked, and he winced for a third time. Way to go, Alcatraz. Somehow, she managed to make it to the Callender ranch without blurting out all the confusion and excitement and fear she was feeling inside, but it was close. Then, once they were there, she and Colt were busy with the ponies, and they both appreciated the help from Val and her girls. Val had chosen a few of the oldest girls who were the best with the animals, and Anna could see how they were practically bursting with pride over being given the responsibility. So yeah, between all of them and Susan, it didn't take too long to get the ponies off the trailer, into their new stalls, and feeling at home. What was cute was the way each girl seemed to bond with one of the animals, and immediately started cooing and fussing and grooming. Val herself seemed particularly taken with Sunshine, the feisty little miss who had given Colt so much trouble. "Are you hungry, sweetie?" she murmured, stroking the pony's mane. "We want to make you feel at home. What's your favorite treat? Carrots? Because I have a carrot just waiting for a good girl like you." Anna realized Colt had stepped up beside her, and when she glanced over, she saw him fold his arms across his chest, smirking. "She's fond of apples," he called out helpfully. "Then apples it is," Val cooed, her attention never leaving the pony. "Barry's class is making lunch, and you're welcome to stay, isn't that right?" "Yes it is." "What a pretty girl you are." "But the meal's not for another 45 minutes. "Is she speaking to us?" murmured Colt. "Or did she just invite Sunshine to lunch?" Anna's lips twitched. "She's talking to us. Barry, one of Val's sisters, runs the cooking classes for the camps. They always cook enough for guests." "That's right," called out Val, in a sing-song voice, still petting Sunshine's nose. "And now I need you both to go for a walk or something, so these beauties can get used to their new home without your scents." Colt snorted. "If I didn't know better, I'd say she just told us we stink." "Stink? No." Even after a day in the barn, Colt smelled like sweat, horse, and leather, which to Anna, were the best scents in the world. "Come on," she murmured, turning to leave the stable. "She's right, the ponies need to focus on their scents, not ours or Susan's. Besides, she and Colt. Well, they needed to talk." Proving how much they thought alike, the two of them strolled along the path toward the river, Susan trotting along beside. Neither of them spoke, but Anna couldn't resist risking glances his way. His chin was lowered, and although his expression was neutral, his brows were drawn in a little, as if maybe he was worried. It wasn't until they reached the river, and the little beach with the boulders where they'd spoken last time, before Colt blew out a breath. "Okay, I can't stand this. I need to explain." He gave Susan the hand signal which released her, and she woofed quietly, then lowered her nose to the ground and trotted off following a scent. Anna thought it was really cute the way the dog was always so curious, and she loved to watch her, but at that moment, she only had eyes for Colt. He just looked so awkward. As if he wasn't sure how to start. But remembering the words he'd blurted beside the trailer that morning, Anna tried to help. "You love me?" she asked quietly, her hands shoved into the pockets of her jeans. He swallowed, pulled his hat off, then jammed it back on his head again. He opened his mouth as if he wanted to say something, but closed it without making a sound. It was just as well, she needed to clarify. "How could you love someone like me?" His breath burst out of him in a half-laugh, half-incredulous sigh. "Someone like you?" This time he did laugh, but it was little more than a harsh bark. "What do you mean? What's wrong with you?" "I'm broken." That wasn't what she'd meant to say, and she shook her head. "I mean, I don't know how to love. How to live happily ever after." "Anna." At his quiet call, she met his eyes. His lips were pulled up on one side, but there was compassion in his eyes as he took her hands. Facing her, he lowered his chin and held her gaze. "You're not broken. You're just private." She gave him a quizzical look. He took a deep breath. "I love you, Anna Alcatraz. I love you because you're as feisty as Sunshine, but twice as pretty. I love you because you're determined and brave and smart. I love you because you think you have to be strong, because cowgirls are strong, but you don't realize how incredibly powerful you really are. I love you, sweetheart." Wow, now would be the perfect time to tell him she loved him too, but Anna couldn't seem to make her voice work. All she could do was stare at him, open-mouthed and more than a little silly-looking, she was certain. "He loves me." And just like that, the enormity of his words crashed into her. He loved her. She sucked in a gasp, and tears flooded her eyes. But rather than being alarmed, Colt smiled, as if that had been the response he'd been hoping for. He squeezed her hands again. "See? Cowgirls do cry," he said, and she knew he was remembering her claim the last time they'd stood beside the river and she'd told him about her past. "There's no rulebook that says cowgirls can't cry. Whatever you do, sweetheart, that's what cowgirls do. And everyone cries, it's normal." His lips twitched. "Hell, even Susan cries when she's hurt, although it's not quite the same." "Do you?" She cleared her throat and tried again. "Do you ever cry? You think because I'm a cowboy, I don't cry?" There was a look in his eyes, as if he were hedging, but he did cry, as she remembered the tears in his eyes when he'd listened to her story. She remembered how he'd looked so heartbroken for her. Colt blew out a breath, squeezed her hands once more, then dropped them and turned away. She was surprised how empty she suddenly felt, without his touch. She, who couldn't stand the thought of a man's touch only a month and a half ago. She, who'd once been scared of Colton Colmenares. Now she yearned for his touch. He took a step toward the river, then another. She watched him pull off his hat once more, then run his hand through his already messy curls. He looked as though he was wrestling with something. Finally, he blew out a breath. Staring across the river, Colt slapped his hat against his thigh. "I cry, Anna," he said quietly. "Not as much anymore, thanks to my therapist and the friends I've made, not to mention the life I built. But yeah, I've cried plenty in my time." Her heart clenched at the finality of his words. Aching to comfort him, she stepped up beside him, reaching for him, but her hand stopped inches from his elbow, not knowing if he wanted her comfort. "He loves you." Yeah, but that didn't mean he wanted her to see him like this. "See? It does. That's what loving someone means. Seeing them in all of their moods and vulnerabilities." Colt inhaled slowly, then said, "You were in the foster system. You were sexually abused, right?" He didn't wait for her answer. A man bigger than you, he touched you in a way he shouldn't have." Anna nodded jerkily, even though he wasn't looking at her, and swallowed down the fear which always threatened when she thought about those days. She had to remind herself that was all in the past, and Colt would never hurt her. Colt exhaled. "Well, me too." It took a moment to process what he'd said, what they'd been speaking about. But when she did, she choked on her gasp and clamped her hand around his arm. "Don't joke about that," she growled, trying to shake him, but having about as much luck as she would moving a mountain. "Not that. I'm not joking." When he finally turned his head to look down at her, she saw sorrow in his eyes, even though his lips were curled on one side in a self-mocking way. "You think little girls are the only ones who can be sexually abused?" His gaze drifted back to the river. "I was younger than you when it happened, long enough ago that I only have vague memories. My therapist calls them repressed." Dios mío. This big, strong man beside her, the one who'd made her feel so safe, he'd gone through the same thing she had? He knew what it was like to feel worthless, to hate your own skin. What? There was a thick ball of sorrow sitting in her throat. She tried again. "What did you do?" "I cried a lot." His smile flashed, but it wasn't a nice one. "I punched a lot too. I was angry and hurt, and I wanted to hurt someone else. That's why I had such a hard time going from home to home in the foster system, because I was still hurting from that." He took a deep, shuddering breath, held it, and turned to her. That's when she saw the tears in his eyes again. "I cried, Anna." "Oh," I cried. Unable to stand the space between them, Anna stepped up in front of him, running her hands down his arms until she could twine her fingers through his. "I'm sorry that happened, Colt," she said quietly. "I'm so sorry." He shrugged. "It was a long time ago, and thanks to my brothers and the army and Susan, and my therapist, I guess, I'm doing okay. I rarely think about it anymore, truthfully." Besides, one side of his lips curled wryly again. "I'm big enough now to know no one can ever hurt me again." Yes, that was his blessing, wasn't it? To her surprise, he used her grip on his fingers to tug her closer. She stumbled slightly when the toe of her boot caught on a rock, but he caught her. "And I'm big enough to protect you too, Anna," he said softly, his eyes searching hers, as if willing her to trust him. "I'll make sure no one will ever hurt you ever again. You just have to trust me." She trusted him. Oh, she trusted him. Taking a deep breath, Anna made her decision. "Come here," she whispered, pulling him toward the large boulder. There was confusion in his eyes, but he followed her, and when she pushed him down to sit on the rock, he didn't resist. "What are you doing?" He was just where she wanted him, sitting on the boulder, legs spread slightly. She stepped up between his knees and pushed his cowboy hat back on his head. In this position, she had to lean down slightly to be even with him, and it was a heady feeling, to know she was taller than him for once, reaching you. Granted, it was a confusing statement, so she wasn't surprised to see confusion flash across his expression again. But when his lips formed the first sound of, "what," it only positioned them perfectly for what she had in mind. Before she lost her nerve, Anna leaned down and brushed her lips across his. That's all she had intended, just a gentle kiss. Her first kiss since she was old enough to know what kissing should be. A kiss she controlled. But as soon as her skin brushed his, he froze, and she couldn't help lingering. Her lips caressed his again, then a third time, and she felt, more than heard, him groan. Her eyes fluttered closed. He was so strong, so hard, and his fingers were still wrapped tightly in hers. But he held himself absolutely still, letting her be in control. He was not only giving her what she needed, but showing her that he understood and respected her. With a sigh, Anna finally straightened, her eyes still closed. "That was nice," she murmured. He made a strangled noise of agreement, and she had to smile. "We'll have to do it again." "We can't." At his croaked response, Anna's eyes flew open. "Why not?" He looked half amused, half in pain when he released one of her hands to scrub at his own face. "Because, sweetheart," he shook his head. "If we do that again, if you kiss me again, I'm not sure I can hold myself back. And if I kiss you the way I want to kiss you, I'm afraid." Rather than scaring her, the knowledge of how badly he wanted her sent a thrill through Anna's body, straight to her core. So her heart was beating a little erratically when she offered a little smile. "Hey," she murmured, "it's okay for cowboys to be afraid." His lovely blue eyes flew open. "Was that a joke?" he blurted, then his lips settled into an easy smile. "That was a joke. I'm wearing you down, Anna Alcatraz." And to her surprise, she didn't hate the sound of that. What would it be like to be the sort of person who smiled and laughed all the time? It sounded exhausting. That wasn't who she was, but at that moment, she knew he loved her for herself. For who she really was. "I love you," she whispered. His smile was immediate and blinding, and he grabbed her hand again. "You do?" "How could I not?" She shrugged. "You've taught me so much," he hummed. "Can I teach you some more?" he murmured, tugging her even closer. This kiss was gentle too, but he took command, and she was happy to learn from him. His hands were in her hair, cupping the back of her head, pulling her ever closer. He held her, cradled her, worshipped her. For the first time ever, Anna felt cherished. His lips and tongue were gentle, but she could taste his passion, held in check for her sake, and she reveled in the sensations he was showing her. Dios mío, I love this man. When they finally pulled apart, Anna was surprised to discover she was sitting in Colt's lap. One of his big arms was wrapped around her waist, holding her snugly in place, while the other played with her hair. Her arms were around his neck, and they were both breathing heavily. "Anna," he whispered. His voice broke on her name, and he pressed his forehead against hers, taking great heaving breaths. She was in a sort of daze, cherishing the feeling of being cherished. So she let him gather himself. Still, when he began to speak, she was amazed. "Anna Alcatraz, I love you. I want to marry you. I want a future with you, sweetheart." He straightened so he could look into her eyes, but tightened his hold on her, as if afraid she would run. I want to show you that a big dog like Susan can be lots of fun too. I want to prove I'm big enough for both of us. I want to make you laugh. His voice cracked, but he cleared his throat. I want to create a ranch which makes enough money to bring in foster kids. Kids like you and me who need a safe place to grow up, knowing they don't have to be strong and hard all the time. He took a deep breath. And I want you by my side, Anna. I know it's early, and I know I did this all backwards. She smiled, remembering his order of operations, and he shook his head. I should have kissed you, then told you I loved you, then asked you to marry me. I did it all wrong and out of order, and I'm sorry. As I recall, cowboy, I kissed you. You did. His expression was serious, for a change. And it was the best kiss I've ever experienced. Oh really? She quipped. Because I liked the second one better. He shook his head again. The first one, where you kissed me. That's the one I want to tell our kids about, assuming you're willing to, you know. He looked a little chagrined. All that stuff. Build his ranch into a home. Open that home to foster children. Love them and each other. But she summed it up with, marry you? Please? Suddenly, his expression burst into another smile, a rueful one. It seemed as if he were never far from a grin, was he? Sweetheart, you don't have to give me an answer. I mean, I'd love it if you said yes, but please don't say no, not yet. Give me a chance, even if it takes years, to show you how good things could be together. How good they could be. Anna wasn't certain they could get any better than they were right now. Her heart felt as if it could take off and soar into the clouds at any given moment. Her fingers played with the curls at the base of his neck as she pursed her lips in thought. There was no question, now. She would marry this man, and they would build a life together. But maybe not today. You know, she mused, I've been putting aside a chunk of money each month, after rent and my truck payments. If we pooled my savings with whatever you're making from the cauldrons, I think we could afford a herd for your ranch, our ranch, by next spring. When he gasped, he squeezed her so suddenly, a chuckle burst out of her. You mean it? He choked out. You're actually considering a future with me? See. While her heart hammered wildly, Anna took a deep breath. I'm not quite ready to say yes, Colt, but I can't say no. I love you. I know I want a future with you, one way or another. There was hesitance in his eyes, and she loved him even more for being willing to back off and let her lead the way when it came to their relationship. So, maybe if I asked you again in a few months, to marry me, I mean, you might say yes, he asked hopefully. She shook her head. I'm saying yes now, Colt. Just, give me time before we actually take that step. As his smile bloomed joyfully, she twined her fingers through his curls again. And in the meantime, give me a few more kisses. His gaze fastened on her lips. I've never been so happy to oblige, Alcatraz, and when his lips captured hers, she felt like laughing. Chapter 10. Colt had been right, it took them a while to work up the nerve to marry. Well, not him, he would have married her the very day they'd discussed it. But he also loved and respected Anna enough to know she didn't move that quickly. So they took their time. They discussed what they wanted from their future, and they learned more and more about one another. And each new experience, each new thing they learned, made him love her even more. And the kisses. God had blessed him indeed, because the kisses they'd shared were just out of this world. At first, it had been only kisses. But as the months passed, and as Colton continued to contain his need for her, he was gratified by the way she had started exploring him. First kisses, then touches, then gentle strokes. The way she ran her fingers through his hair, or the way she brushed her lips against the side of his neck when she was cuddled up in his lap. Well, he hadn't felt this close to exploding since he'd been a teenager. It was a wonderful sort of torture, and one he gladly underwent, just to see her grow more and more relaxed around him. Visiting Cipher Range for the first time had been an overwhelming experience for her as all of the guys crowded around. But when Colt realized how hard she was trying to remember their names and interests, just because they were his family, well, he fell even deeper in love with her then. There was snow on the ground when they finally said their adios. They'd planned a simple church wedding, with Val as her maid of honor and Kemp as his best man. Susan, of course, wore a big red bow on her collar, which she'd managed to chew off before the ceremony had really started. It was nice and straightforward, just like his love for Anna. But apparently, they weren't going to get away without a reception. Luckily, they didn't have to plan it at all. When the word had gotten around Cauldron Ranch they were getting married, the ranch's housekeeper, Griselda, had marched down to the stables, looked them both up and down, and smiled broadly. "I'm making your wedding cupcakes, no argument." Anna had beamed. "We'd be grateful, ma'am." Remembering Don's wedding, where he'd tasted that red cupcake Griselda had made, and the treat he'd received from the housekeeper on his first day of work here at the ranch, Colt asked, "What kind?" As if understanding, the old woman had shaken a finger at him. "You'll just have to be surprised, young man." "But I think," she pursed her lips, then cocked her head as if listening to an inner voice. "No, I don't think we'll have a special cupcake at this particular reception. I think I'll take a little break from matchmaking for a while." Matchmaking? What was she talking about? But Anna didn't seem to care. She just squeezed Colt's hand and smiled softly. "All of your cupcakes are special, Griselda." And as far as Colt was concerned, they were. Here they were, halfway through the reception, and he'd already eaten 4. "You've got a bit of white frosting on your lips, mi amor," Anna teased, eyes twinkling as he swayed with her to a slow dance. He made a show of trying to lick it off, which just made her giggle, actually giggle. Yeah, his cowgirl had come a long way, at least where he was concerned, and he'd pull any sort of silly stunt to make her smile like that at him. "I think I need some help," he admitted. She hummed and cocked a brow. "Lean down," she commanded. When he did, thinking she'd wipe up the frosting, his new wife surprised him by rising up on her toes and licking at his lips. He surged back, staring down in shock at his smirking bride. And around them, the cowboys and cowgirls of Cauldron Valley burst into raucous cheers. Yeah, this was his family, not just his foster brothers from Cipher Range, and not just the Calendar sisters from Calendar Ranch, but also the friends he'd met at Cauldron Ranch, who were just as happy for the two of them as the rest were. "Kiss. Give Alcatraz a kiss," came a cry from the crowd, and it was soon picked up by the other guests. Colt smiled down at her. "You know, my love, if you want to stay Alcatraz, you can. I'd love for you to take Colmenares as your last name, but you don't have to, if you want people to keep calling you Alcatraz." She cocked her head and studied him. I think I'd like to be Alcatraz for as long as I'm working at Cauldron Valley." They'd been working out the details, and with her savings, and the money he'd made from his work on the ranch, they'd soon have enough to buy a starter herd of their own. "But once we go full-time to your place, I think I'd like to be Mrs. Colton Colmenares." "Our place, wife." After all, she'd been working hard there the last few months, same as him. "Kiss her." The cry picked up in intensity. "Gladly," he whispered, lowering his lips to hers. When they finally pulled apart, her arms around his neck and him holding her off the ground, both were breathing heavily, and the evidence of how much he wanted her was pressed against her belly. "I think," he panted, "that I would very much like to take my wife away from all this noise, and get to know her better." His eyes searched hers, waiting for a sign, anything, that she wasn't ready for this next step in their relationship. But all he saw was joy. "I'd like that," she whispered, and when he shifted his hold on her, scooping her up under her knees, the hooting and hollering from their family and friends grew even louder. "Susan," he bellowed over the noise. "Come on. We're going home." The dog barked happily, chasing after them, as the cheers continued. Once, Anna's therapist had told her sex between two people could be a wonderful, joyful experience. She hadn't believed it, because of her past. She'd always thought sex was a way to control, to hurt, to make someone else feel even smaller. But then she'd met Colt. Then she'd kissed Colt, and now Anna knew the truth. Sex with the man she loved was one of the most amazing experiences of her life. He'd locked Susan out of the master bedroom and had taken Anna in his arms. He'd been so wonderfully gentle, but intense, as he'd peeled her clothes off her, kissing each inch of skin as it was exposed. Soon she was shivering with need, desperate for something she didn't quite understand. But he understood, and he showed her in full, loving perfection. Everything about him was big, but he didn't scare her anymore. Instead, she now saw his size as safety and protection. The way he worshipped her body told her that story, as well as the words he whispered. His hands were big enough to cup her breasts in their entirety, but that only served to inflame her need, and she arched against him, moaning his name. His lips, Dios mío, his lips, were everywhere, making her ready for him. And when he finally entered her, the pain she'd been ready for seemed minor after the way he apologized and soothed her. Lying under him, filled by him, was such a gentle, special feeling, that Anna wrapped her arms around his neck, blinked away the tears, and met his gaze. I love you, Colt. Make me yours, por favor. He did. Oh, he did. He was slow at first, using gentle strokes, which made her sigh with pleasure. But as they became used to one another, their pace increased, and soon she was whimpering with need. And when she found her pleasure, moments before him, it felt so perfect, she laughed. Afterwards, she lay draped across his chest, her hair spilling across him and her fingers drawing designs on his skin. He was touching her idly, his palm brushing up and down her thigh as he smiled. I love you, he whispered. Anna hummed. Mi amor, you've shown me so much love, I don't think I'll ever be able to fully explain what you mean to me. This? Tonight. She shook her head and pressed her cheek to his skin. Thank you. His hand came up to cup her bottom. No. Thank you. Thank you for trusting me, Anna. Thank you for opening yourself up to me. Thank you for loving me enough to marry me. I do, she whispered. I do love you. I love you because... When she trailed off, he picked up his head so he was peering down his chest at her and lifted his brow. What? He mumbled. She was blushing, but she lifted her head and met his eyes. I love you because you taught me a cowgirl doesn't have to be strong. I love you because you showed me how to face my past and my fears, about everything. Big men in particular. You taught me that I deserve to be safe, and I know I can trust you to keep me safe. I love you for showing me your family, and the plans you have for your foster children's ranch. I love you for everything you are, mi amor, and everything you've done. His eyes had widened through her fervent speech, and she saw his lips form a silent O. Then he shook his head and wrapped his arms around her. His suddenly wicked smile should have been enough of a warning, but she still squealed in surprise when he rolled, taking her with him. You sure do know how to make a man feel special, don't you? He drawled, his eyes caressing her features as he slowly smiled. She wrapped her arms around his neck and grinned right back, feeling completely and utterly at ease in this man's bed and in his arms. In his heart. In his life. In his future. It's only fair, since you make me feel special every moment of every day, she whispered. That's because you are special. Kiss me, husband. He grinned. I love you, he murmured, right before his lips claimed hers. Epilogue. Beth, dear, I must have the recipe to these macaroons. They taste like marshmallow breakfast cereal. Beth Callender winked cheekily at her Aunt Griselda, the housekeeper and cook from the Cauldron Ranch. A lady never tells. Not many people in town realized Griselda was related to the Calendars through Beth's side, but that was because Grizzy, as Beth had grown up calling her, was often overshadowed by her sister Brunhilde, who'd been the Callender housekeeper for much longer. The older woman just scoffed and scooted closer, as if afraid they might be overheard. Go on, she urged. You can tell me the secret ingredient. Love. It's love, isn't it? Chuckling, Beth jerked her head toward the corner. The monthly potluck luncheon for the Cauldron Valley Women's Association might ostentatiously be to discuss charitable projects and town holiday celebrations, but no one could deny that much of the draw was the chance to sample and judge each other's cooking. As far as Beth was concerned, after raising 13 children and having a hand in mothering hundreds more, What she was excited about was the chance to eat someone else's cooking for a change. Well? Griselda demanded breathlessly, when they ducked behind a conveniently placed, large potted plant. What was this thing? A fern? Beth winked again. I didn't make them. Barry did. The older woman gasped, then giggled. That September, excuse me, Barry, is a delightful baker. I swear these taste just like Lucky Charms. That's because she soaks the marshmallows overnight before making the buttercream, Beth confessed. When I mentioned I was stressed, because I still needed to find something to bring today, she jumped right up to volunteer. Apparently, this was the recipe she and the girls worked on yesterday. Sighing happily, Griselda took a dainty bite of the treat. She is a treasure. All your girls are angels. I've often wondered, she bit off her thought with a shake of her head. My red cupcake baking days are over for now. Beth blinked in confusion. Red cupcake baking? Do you need help from Barry? Goodness, no. Griselda laughed. I was just thinking out loud. I had a teensy-weensy hand in 1 or 2 matches on the Cauldron Ranch, you know. I didn't, Beth murmured, her gaze going across the room to where 2 of her oldest daughters were chatting with a friend from school. Her aunt followed her gaze. That's Jana and Val, isn't it? Your 2 oldest? 2 of the 3. Marcy wanted to come, but forgot she promised to take over one of May's classes. Beth sighed. I swear, that girl could forget her own head if it weren't bolted on. Well then, thank goodness for bolts. Griselda laughed at her own joke. And am I correct in remembering, none of your girls are married? Sighing, Beth shook her head and managed to roll her eyes at the same time. A few of them have told me they're ready, but just as many refuse, saying they're married to their jobs. Well, for most of them, their jobs are the ranch. I'm despairing ever having grandchildren. Do you think? Griselda cocked her head to one side and studied the younger women chatting happily. Is it possible that they're each afraid to marry, on some level, because they think it'll mean moving away from the ranch and the camps you and your family have built? Maybe. Likely. Beth sighed again. I know that's Bob's reason, definitely, he said as much. He believes the whole place would fall down around us without him. I try to explain that we'll manage. Junie works outside the ranch, after all, and still manages our scholarships, but the poor boy refuses to take a break. I'll bet his sisters are the same way. Griselda used the hand holding a half-eaten macaroon to push aside a fern so she could keep Jana and Val in her sights. They each have their own specialty, right? I mean, in helping to keep the camps going? Beth nodded proudly. The calendar girls, and soon-to-be boys, ranch had grown so much in the years since her children were able to help. The 15 of them were a team, and she was proud of each and every one of them. Jana is in charge of our arts and crafts program, which, as you can imagine, is extensive. Val is in charge of our stables and animals, while Marcy is one of our nature lovers. They've each worked so hard to figure out how to take what they love and make it a part of our camps. I just wish. When she trailed off, Griselda shot her a knowing look. You just wish they could each find a partner who recognized how special they are and treat them accordingly. Beth blinked. Yes. Yes, that's it exactly. I mean, of course I want grandbabies, a million grandbabies, I already have my grandma name picked out and everything, but I want them to be happy, and I don't want them to miss their chance finding the person who will make them happy, just because they're working so hard at the camps. Well, I can certainly understand that. And Beth, I might have some suggestions for you. When Beth met the older woman's eyes, she was surprised to see the twinkle there. Griselda definitely had some experience in this sort of thing, it was obvious. When her aunt popped the rest of Barry's macaroon into her mouth with a wink, Beth was suddenly filled with a bubble of excitement. Griselda could help her nudge her children along the road to love, which was exactly what needed to happen. Smiling with anticipation, Beth leaned closer when Griselda said, "Now here's what you need to do." As soon as Griselda finished her explanation, Beth felt like clapping. There were many stories about the women of power she and her family had descended from, and she had always wanted to be more like them. Why What if the powers her ancestors had ran in her veins as well? Her mother had told her stories of triplets who had saved the world with their powers. Oh, she knew she didn't have powers like that, but what if she had a little bit of matchmaker in her? She'd use every ounce of power within her if it meant securing her children happy matches. Thank you, dear reader, for reading and enjoying the Cowboys of Cauldron Valley. This series is over, but don't worry, we're just moving locations within Cauldron Valley. I'm sure you're dying to know more about the Calendar Girls Ranch, right? What could Griselda tell Beth, which might help move things along with her 12 daughters, and her son, Bob? Find out in Jana's romance, Joyful January.